They etched ugly on her forehead before sending her to the Duke's Manor. He asked who did it. The morning Mei Lin arrived at the Harlow estate, she was not introduced. She was delivered. The cart that brought her from the city had no cover. Rain had fallen steadily for the first half of the journey, soaking through the thin gray coat she wore, the only coat she owned. By the time the cart stopped at the iron gate at the end of a long gravel road, the rain had stopped, but she was cold all the way through. The driver did not speak to her. He dropped a small bundle at her feet, the only things that belonged to her in the world, and pointed toward the gate without turning his head. Then the cart moved away, and she stood there alone, with her bundle in her arms, and the wind cutting across the open field behind her. She did not cry. She had not cried in a long time. Mei Lin was 22 years old, though most people who saw her assumed she was younger. She was small and quiet, in the way that people become when they have spent years trying not to take up too much space. Her face was calm almost always, not because she felt nothing, but because she had learned that showing what she felt changed nothing. People who had power over her did not become kinder when she showed pain. They became more certain of it. She picked up her bundle, walked to the gate, and pushed it open. The gravel crunched under her worn shoes as she walked toward the large stone house at the end of the path. The Harlow estate was impressive in the way that old wealth always is, not loud or showy, but settled and certain of itself. The walls were dark stone covered in places with ivy that had gone brown at the edges with the season. The windows were tall and narrow. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys. There were no flowers in the garden, just trimmed hedges and bare soil where something might grow in spring. She knocked on the side door, the servants' entrance, as she had been instructed. A woman opened it after a long wait. She was perhaps 50, with a sharp face and gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her expression flat. She looked at Mei Lin the way a person looks at something unexpected that has appeared on their doorstep. Not pleased, not angry, simply calculating what to do with it. "You are the girl sent from the Alderton house?" she said. "Yes," Mei Lin said. "I am." The woman looked her up and down. Her eyes stopped briefly at Mei Lin's forehead, where the wound was still healing, still visible. A narrow, raised line of damaged skin, where the character had been pressed into her. The woman said nothing about it. She stepped back and let Mei Lin inside. "I am Mrs. Dunn," the woman said, walking ahead without waiting for Mei Lin to close the door. "I manage this household. You will answer to me for all daily matters. The Duke does not concern himself with the running of the house. You will not bother him, you will not speak to him unless he speaks to you first, and you will not be seen in the main rooms unless you are called there. Do you understand?" "Yes," Mei Lin said. "Your duties will be explained in the morning. Tonight you will eat in the kitchen and sleep in the room at the end of the east corridor. There are 2 other girls who share that wing. You will not disturb them." Mei Lin followed Mrs. Dunn through a narrow corridor that smelled of polish and old wood. The kitchen was large and warm, which was the first real comfort she had felt in days. A young woman was washing dishes at the stone sink, her back to them. Another was setting bread on a rack near the fire. Neither of them looked up immediately when Mei Lin and Mrs. Dunn entered, but after Mrs. Dunn spoke a few quiet words, they both turned. Their eyes went to her forehead. Both of them looked away quickly. Mei Lin set her bundle down near the wall and sat at the table where Mrs. Dunn pointed. A bowl of soup was placed in front of her. She ate it slowly, tasting each spoonful, because she had not eaten since the previous morning, and her body was grateful for the warmth, even if no one in the room was looking at her with warmth. The 2 other servants introduced themselves only after Mrs. Dunn left. The one washing dishes was named Clara, a girl of about 19 with red hands and an open face. The one near the fire was older, perhaps 30, named Edith, and she was quieter and more careful in how she spoke. Clara was the one who asked. She waited until Edith had stepped out to the pantry, and then she leaned slightly forward across the table and said, in a low voice that was trying to be kind, "Does it hurt? Your forehead?" "It did at first." Clara nodded. She seemed to want to ask more, but wasn't sure how far she was allowed to go. "Who did it?" she finally said. Mei Lin looked at her soup. "Family," she said. Clara said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry." Mei Lin looked up at her. The girl meant it. That was clear. There was no calculation in her face, no careful distance. She was simply sorry, the way a person is sorry, when they hear something that hurts them on someone else's behalf. Mei Lin had not received that kind of sorry in a very long time, and she did not quite know what to do with it, so she simply said, "Thank you," and finished her soup. That night, lying on the narrow bed in the east corridor room, she stared at the dark ceiling and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Old houses always make noise at night. Beams tightening, pipes ticking, wind finding the small gaps in old walls. She listened to all of it and thought about the life that had brought her here. Her father's name had been George Lin. He had been a merchant of modest success, enough to own a small shop in the city, enough to give Mei Lin a proper education, to pay a tutor for her until she was 12, to fill their small house with books he bought second-hand and read aloud to her in the evenings. He had been a good man in the particular way that gentle men are good, not strong in any outward sense, but kind, consistent, genuinely interested in the world and in his daughter's place in it. He had died when Mei Lin was 14. He died of an illness that started small and then wasn't, which is how many things end. He had debts when he died, which is how many stories begin. The shop was sold, the house was sold, the books were sold. Everything her father had built or gathered or loved was sold to pay for what he owed, and what was left after all the selling was Mei Lin, who owed nothing and owned nothing, standing in the doorway of her aunt's house with her single bag. Her aunt's name was Frances Alderton. She was her father's older sister, a woman who had married into a family with modest status and a great deal of pride about it. She had a husband named Charles who worked in local government and was rarely home, and she had 2 daughters, Patricia, who was 20 when Mei Lin arrived, and Louise, who was 17. Frances Alderton had agreed to take Mei Lin in because refusing would have looked badly in the circles she cared about, but accepting came with its own kind of cost, which was the cost she passed on to Mei Lin every day. From the first week, Mei Lin worked, not as a member of the family, but as something between a guest and a servant, which meant she had neither the dignity of a servant who is paid, nor the protection of a family member who is loved. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended things, she carried water and wood and heavy baskets from the market. She ate after the family had finished. She slept in a room at the back of the house that was not quite warm enough in winter and not quite cool enough in summer. She asked for nothing and was given just enough to keep her there and working. Her aunt never spoke to her cruelly in front of guests. Frances Alderton was too careful for that. But in the ordinary hours of the day, she spoke to Mei Lin with a particular kind of coldness that was more effective than shouting. A low, steady dismissal, the tone a person uses for objects that are not doing quite what they should. "You did this wrong. That is not how we do things here. You are slow today." Not screamed, just said, the way you say that the milk has gone off, or the fire needs more wood. Patricia, the older cousin, simply ignored her. Patricia had her own concerns, her appearance, her prospects, a young man from a good family she was pursuing with focused energy, and Mei Lin was not interesting enough to acknowledge. That indifference was almost bearable. It had a kind of neutrality to it. Louise was different. Louise was 17, and she had decided, for reasons Mei Lin never fully understood, that she disliked Mei Lin with a particular intensity. It was not random cruelty. It was the kind of dislike that comes from something specific, some comparison being made inside the person's head, some competition they had decided existed. Mei Lin had not entered any competition, but Louise had decided she was in one, and she had also decided she was losing. Maybe it was the books. Mei Lin read when she had a spare moment, anything she could find, and she read quickly and absorbed what she read. She had helped Frances Alderton once with a letter that needed to be written, and the writing had been very good, and Frances had not thanked her, but had looked at the letter for a long time before folding it. Maybe Louise had seen that look and felt something about it. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe Louise simply needed someone she could feel above, and Mei Lin was the safest choice. Whatever the reason, Louise's version of cruelty was more active than her mother's cold dismissal. She hid things Mei Lin needed. She said things just loud enough to be heard. She told the household the soup Mei Lin made was too thin, the floors she mopped still dirty, the firewood she stacked done incorrectly, none of which were true, all of which Mei Lin had to stand and accept in silence. 8 years passed like that, 8 years of being in that house and not of it, of working for people who did not see her and enduring the attention of one who saw her only to reduce her. She had no friends in the house, and few outside it. She went to the market once a week, to the church on Sundays where she sat in the back and spoke to no one. She kept a small notebook that she hid under her mattress, in which she wrote down things she observed, things that interested her, things she wanted to remember. The notebook was not a diary. It did not say how she felt. It said what she noticed. A tree, changing through seasons, outside the back window. The way the light in the kitchen changed in early December. A phrase she read somewhere and wanted to keep. The notebook was the most honest thing she had. When she was 22, her aunt's husband, Charles Alderton, made several bad investments in quick succession. He had not been a brilliant man in good times. In bad times, he was worse. The debts accumulated in a way that Frances Alderton hid from her social circle, but could not hide from herself, or from the creditors, who began to arrive at the door. Something had to be done. Something had to be given. The Harlow estate was known in the county. Duke Edward Harlow was known the way powerful, quiet men are known, not through gossip exactly, but through a kind of steady presence. He was 38. He had been a widower for 3 years. He ran a large estate and several business concerns, and he did both efficiently, and the only thing remarkable that anyone said about him was that he was not remarkable in the way people expected a man of his position to be. He did not host large parties. He did not appear in the papers. He lived carefully, and he ran things well, and he was rarely seen in the city. Charles Alderton, through a connection at his government office, reached an arrangement. The arrangement was what arrangements like this always were, not stated plainly, wrapped in language about service and opportunity and mutual benefit. Maylin would go to the Harlow estate as a member of household staff. The debt that hung over the Alderton family would be resolved through the connection the arrangement created. It was not a sale, no one called it that, but Maylin, who was told about it 3 days before she was sent, understood what it was. She said nothing. She packed her bundle. She kept her notebook inside it, wrapped in a cloth, in the center where it would not be crushed. She did not say goodbye to Frances or Patricia. Louise came to the back corridor, where Maylin was putting on her coat, before dawn on the morning of her departure. Louise did not say goodbye either. What Louise said was nothing. What she did was something that Maylin had no warning of, and no ability to stop. Later, when Maylin tried to piece it together in her memory, she could only gather fragments. She had been standing at the small mirror near the back door, tying her hair. It was before 5 in the morning, and the house was dark, except for the low lamp she had lit. She had heard Louise's footsteps, and had assumed Louise was going to the kitchen for water, and she had turned back to the mirror. And then there was a pain above her brow, sharp and specific, not like a cut, more like something being pressed in, and she had pulled away and turned, but Louise was already walking away down the corridor. She had not known, in that moment, what had been done to her. She had pressed her hand to her forehead, and felt warmth, and pulled her hand away, and seen the faint mark of it, in the dim mirror, but not understood its shape. It was only later, much later, that she learned the word that had been pressed into her skin. She had stood in that dim corridor for a moment, her heart very loud in her ears, and then she had picked up her bundle and walked out the door, because the cart was waiting, and she had nowhere else to go. And that was how she arrived at the Harlow estate, cold and quiet, with a wound on her forehead, and 8 years of patience that had not yet broken, though it had been tested in ways that would have broken most people long before. In the dark of the east corridor bedroom that first night, listening to the house make its sounds around her, she thought about her father. She thought about him reading to her by lamplight in their small house, his voice careful and warm, pausing at good sentences to let them settle. She thought about the way he looked at her, not with the assessing eyes of someone calculating her value, but with the simple look of a man who loved his daughter and found her interesting. She kept that look somewhere inside her, in a place she had learned to protect. She took it out sometimes when things were very hard, and held it in her mind until she felt steadier. She took it out now. Then she closed her eyes and slept. She woke before the birds, because she always did. She dressed in the dark, by feel, her hands knowing her own clothes. She folded the blanket on the bed precisely. She checked that her notebook was still in her bundle, tucked against the wall. Then she stood in the narrow room for a moment, in the early stillness, and she breathed carefully, in and out, the way her father had taught her when she was small, and frightened of something. "Just breathe through it," he had said. "Everything is survivable, if you can breathe through it." She opened the door and went to face whatever this new place intended to make of her. The kitchen was already warm. Clara was there, feeding wood into the stove, still half asleep, her hair not yet pinned. She looked up when Mei Lin came in, and her eyes went immediately, reflexively, to her forehead. And then she caught herself, and looked away, and then back again, this time at Mei Lin's face, just her face. "Morning," Clara said. "Good morning," Mei Lin said. "I'll show you where everything is." "Thank you," Mei Lin said, and she began. She was careful in those first days. Careful the way you are when you are new somewhere and do not yet know which floorboards creak, or which doors stick, or which people in the house have quiet tempers, and which ones have loud ones. She watched more than she spoke. She worked steadily and without complaint. She made no mistakes that anyone could point to, partly because she was genuinely careful and skilled, and partly because she knew that in a new place, a single mistake made by someone who has already been marked as different becomes the thing that defines them. The other servants treated her with a range of responses. Clara was the warmest, not because she made a great effort, but because warmth was her natural way, and it extended to Mei Lin without calculation. Edith was professional and fair, neither kind nor unkind, simply clear about what needed to be done and correct in her expectations. There was a man named Oliver who worked in the stables and came into the kitchen twice a day, and he never looked at her forehead at all, which she appreciated more than she said. There was a younger boy named Sam who ran errands and who stared at her openly the first week, with the unself-conscious curiosity of someone who has not yet learned to hide his looking, and she did not mind that either. Honest staring was easier than the sideways kind. Mrs. Dunn remained the most complicated presence. She was not unkind, but she had a system, and everything in the house existed inside that system, and anything that did not fit the system precisely created a kind of friction in her that she expressed through excessive instruction. She told Mei Lin the correct way to fold linen 4 separate times in the first week. The linen had been folded correctly the first time. Mei Lin folded it the same way each time and said nothing. The house itself was quiet, in a way she was not used to. The Alderton house had been full of movement and noise, not pleasant noise, but constant. Francis's voice carrying through walls, Louise's footsteps on the stairs, Charles arriving and departing, the daughter's friends coming and going. It had been the noise of a household that is always performing for itself. The Harlow estate was different. It was a house where the quiet was real, where a person could hear their own thoughts without having to fight through the sounds of other people's lives. She noticed the library on her third day. It was on the ground floor at the end of a corridor. She had been sent down to collect a silver tray that had been left on a side table. The door to the library was open, and she stopped in the doorway for just a moment. It was a large room, with tall shelves on 3 walls, all of them full. There was a desk near the window with papers on it, neatly stacked. There were 2 chairs near the fireplace, dark leather, the kind that have been sat in so many times they have taken on the shape of the people who sat in them. The room smelled of old paper and wood and something else she could not name, something that felt like serious thought. She stood in the doorway for perhaps 5 seconds. Then she picked up the tray from the side table and walked back down the corridor. She did not go back to the doorway, but she thought about the room. On the 5th day, Mrs. Dunn gave her a new task. The household accounts had fallen behind. The previous girl who had managed the records had left suddenly, Mrs. Dunn said, without explaining why. The records needed to be caught up and organized. Weekly purchases, supplier invoices, staff hours, household expenses. Mrs. Dunn handed her a ledger and a box of loose papers with a look that suggested she expected this to be a problem. Mei Lin took the ledger and the box of papers to the small table in the pantry where Mrs. Dunn said she could work. She opened the ledger and looked at the entries for the months before. The previous girl had made several small errors in addition, easy mistakes, but consistent ones. The kind that came from not checking your own work. Mei Lin could see the pattern immediately. She set the errors aside mentally and began with the loose papers, sorting them by date and type before adding anything to the ledger. She worked for 3 hours and caught up all the missing entries and also corrected the earlier errors without being asked to do either. She brought the ledger back to Mrs. Dunn. Mrs. Dunn sat down and read through it. She turned pages slowly. Her expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted slightly, the way a person shifts when they are adjusting an opinion. "You've done the corrections back to March," she said. "They were small," Mei Lin said. "I thought it was better to have the records accurate." Mrs. Dunn looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said, "it is." She did not say anything else, but the next morning, she handed Mei Lin the current week's invoices without instruction, simply handed them to her, and moved on, which was the closest thing to a compliment Mei Lin had received in a very long time. On the 7th day, she met the Duke. It was not planned. She was carrying the replenished ledger to the study, where Mrs. Dunn had said it should be kept, walking quickly down the main hallway, when the front door opened, and a man came in out of the morning light. He was tall, with dark hair that had gray at the temples. He wore a coat dusted with something from outside, mud or road dust, and he was pulling off his riding gloves as he came in. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped too. They looked at each other across the length of the hallway. He did not look at her forehead, or rather, he looked at her face, the whole of it, in the way a person looks at a face when they are actually seeing the person in it. His eyes were dark and steady, and he did not look away quickly, or look elsewhere with the particular discomfort she had come to expect. "You are new here," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "I arrived this week. I am Mei Lin. I am helping with the household records." He nodded once, a brief and genuine acknowledgement. "I am Edward Harlow," he said. She had known who he was, of course, but she said, "It is nice to meet you, sir," because it seemed like the right thing to say. He looked at her for a moment longer, and she was aware that he was noting something. She did not know what. And then he gave a short nod. "Welcome to the house," he said, and he walked past her toward the study. She stood in the hallway for a moment, after he had gone. Then she continued to where she was going. That evening in the kitchen, Clara asked her if she had seen the Duke. Briefly, in the hallway, Mei Lin said. "What did he say?" "He introduced himself," Mei Lin said, "and he welcomed me to the house." Clara nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "He does not usually do that," she said, "introduce himself to new staff." Mei Lin considered this. Perhaps he was simply being polite, she said. Clara looked at her. Perhaps, she said, but she did not sound certain. The debt that Charles Alderton owed did not arrive quietly or without warning. Debt rarely does. It sends small signals first, the way a storm sends cold air ahead of it, and the people who later say they were surprised are usually the ones who chose not to look at the signals. Charles was one of those people. He had a talent for not looking at things that made him uncomfortable, which is a useful talent when life is smooth, and a devastating one when it stops being. The first signal had been the Fenwick contract. Charles worked in local government, a mid-level position that gave him access to certain procurement decisions, and he had for many years operated with a comfortable arrangement in which he directed some of those decisions toward businesses whose owners were grateful enough to remember him at the right moments. It was not honest work, but it was not unusual work for the circles he moved in, and he had never been challenged on it directly, because the people who might have challenged it had their own arrangements they preferred not to examine. But the Fenwick contract was larger than the others, and the man he had directed it toward, a supplier named Gerald Holt, had made promises to Charles about the return that were much larger than anything previously agreed. Charles had taken those promises seriously enough to borrow against them. He had borrowed from 3 sources, each of them men who were comfortable enough on the surface but were, beneath it, the kind of men who expected repayment with the same quiet efficiency that they had provided the loan. Gerald Holt, as it turned out, had been making the same promises to several different people simultaneously and delivering on none of them. By the time Charles understood what had happened, the contract had been awarded, Holt had taken his fee, and the return Charles had been promised simply did not exist. Holt had moved on to another city and another arrangement. Charles was left holding the borrowed amount and no way to repay it. Frances found out on a Tuesday in October, when the first of the 3 men sent someone to the house. She found out the rest of it over the following 2 days, as Charles explained, in pieces, the full shape of what had happened. Frances Alderton was not a patient woman in her private life. She was controlled in public because control served her purposes, but in the house she was sharp and exacting, and Charles had always found ways to keep unpleasant truths from reaching her until he had already partially fixed them. This time, he had no partial fix. He had nothing. She listened to all of it, with a stillness that he found more frightening than any shouting would have been. When he was finished, she did not speak for a long moment. She sat at the dining table with her hands flat on the surface and looked at a point above his head, as if she were calculating in a language he could not see. "How long before they come directly?" she said. "A week," he said. "Perhaps 2. She was silent again. Then she said, "There is the Harlow connection." Charles looked at her. "Through the office?" "Through William Marsh," she said. William Marsh was a man Charles had done business with in the past, a man whose son had recently gone to work on the Harlow estate's business side. "You will speak to William. You will explain that you have something to offer." "And what are we offering?" Charles said. Frances looked at him then, directly, and what he saw in her face was not anger, not exactly. It was the look of a person who has decided that the situation requires a certain kind of ruthlessness, and who is not troubled by having that quality when it is needed. "We are offering a girl," she said, "who works very hard and asks for nothing." Charles was quiet for a moment. "Mei Lin," he said. "She is costing us more than she provides," Frances said. "She eats. She takes up a room. And she has given me ideas above herself since the day she arrived. She has worked very hard," Charles said, but his voice did not have conviction in it. He was not a man of conviction when it was inconvenient. "She works hard because she has nothing else," Frances said. "That is not a virtue. That is a condition, and it is a condition that will serve her just as well at Harlow's estate as it does here. More so, perhaps. They have actual work for her there." Charles nodded. He was already partly persuaded, because he always was when Frances spoke with that particular certainty. "And the debt?" "William will arrange it," Frances said. "He owes me a word of goodwill. I have kept his secrets long enough to have earned at least that." And so the arrangement was made. It was made over 2 conversations between Frances and William Marsh, which Charles was not part of. Frances gave nothing in writing. She was too careful for that. But the understanding was clear enough. The Aldertons would provide a skilled household worker for the Duke's estate, someone who required no salary beyond room and board, a gesture of goodwill toward a man whose influence in the county could ease several difficulties if it ran in the right direction. In exchange, William Marsh would speak to the right person at the right moment, and the matter of Charles Alderton's debt would be allowed to settle quietly, without the involvement of anyone who would make it public. Mei Lin was told on a Wednesday evening, 3 days before she was to leave. Frances called her into the sitting room, which she rarely did, because the sitting room was a family space, and Mei Lin was not considered family. Frances sat in the high-backed chair near the window, and did not invite Mei Lin to sit. "You are to go to the Harlow estate," Frances said. "You will work there in the household. It has been arranged. You will leave Saturday before dawn." Mei Lin stood in the doorway and looked at her aunt. She had known for some years that her aunt had no affection for her. That had never surprised her, because affection requires some kind of seeing, and Frances had never truly looked at her. What she had not been certain of was how far her aunt was willing to go. Now she knew. "I understand," Mei Lin said. Frances looked at her as if she expected something more, some resistance or distress that she could respond to. Mei Lin gave her nothing. "You should be grateful," Frances said. "It is a good estate. You will be properly housed." "Yes," Mei Lin said. "Thank you, Aunt." The thank you made Frances uncomfortable. Mei Lin could see it. She said it anyway. She walked back to her room and sat on her bed and thought. She thought about whether there was anything she could do, any action she could take, to change what had been decided for her. She ran through the possibilities in the methodical way she ran through most things, examining each one. She could refuse to go. She had no money, and nowhere to go if she left the Alderton house, and she would be left in the street. She could write a letter to someone, but to whom, and saying what, and to what end? She could try to find work in the city on her own terms. But without a letter of reference, and without connections, that was nearly impossible for a young woman with nothing behind her. The possibilities reduced themselves one by one, until there was only the one that remained. She would go. She did not feel broken by this. She felt something colder than broken, something more precise. She felt the specific feeling of a person who has understood, at a cellular level, that the people in their life have placed a particular value on them, and that the value is very low. It was not the first time she had understood this, but understanding it in the form of an arrangement, a trade, a quiet negotiation, in which she was the thing being exchanged, and not the person being considered, gave it a new clarity. She began to pack. She packed slowly and with care, because she had learned that the way you handle your own things is one of the ways you maintain your own sense of yourself. She folded each item precisely. She checked that the notebook was whole, and that the pen she kept with it still had ink. She organized the small bundle so that the things she needed first were on top. Louise came to the room on the Friday night, the night before Mei Lin was to leave. She did not knock. She simply opened the door and stood in the frame. Mei Lin was sitting on the bed with her bundle beside her, dressed for warmth, because she knew the morning would be cold. She looked at Louise. Louise looked back at her. In the years they had lived under the same roof, Mei Lin had thought about Louise more than she had ever let on. She had thought about what drove the particular quality of Louise's cruelty, the focus of it, the personal feeling that ran through it. She had concluded, over time, that Louise disliked her for the most honest possible reason, because Mei Lin was, in some way that Louise could sense but not articulate, more real than she was. Mei Lin's circumstances had required her to be fully present inside herself, to know what she thought and felt and valued, because she had nothing else. Louise had been provided for in every material way, and had never been required to build anything inside herself, and she knew, somewhere beneath her confidence, that this had left her hollow in a specific place. But understanding a person's reasons for cruelty does not make the cruelty easier to receive. Louise did not say anything. She stepped into the room, and Mei Lin rose from the bed, because something in the way Louise moved made her want to be standing. She stood and watched Louise cross the room toward her, and then there was a sudden sharp pain above her right brow, focused and burning, not like a cut, more like something being pressed deliberately into her skin. And she reached up with her hand, but Louise was already moving away, already at the door, already gone. The pain stayed. It was sharp and specific, and she pressed her fingers gently against the place, and they came away faintly warm. She went to the small mirror she kept above the shelf, and looked. The dim lamplight was not bright enough to show her more than the outline of what had been done. A mark above her brow, darkened and raised at the edges. She did not know its shape. She could not see it clearly enough to read it. She stood at the mirror for a long time, her heart beating faster than usual, her hand still pressed gently to her forehead. The pain was dulling to a throb. She breathed, in and out, steadily, the way her father had taught her, the way that had gotten her through 8 years of a house that was never home. Then she went to bed. She slept, because exhaustion is its own mercy, and she woke before the lamp had burned down, and she dressed and picked up her bundle, and walked out into the dark corridor, and through the dark house, and out the back door, into the cold before dawn air. The cart was at the gate. She did not look back at the house. She did not know, as the cart moved through the gray dark morning streets, what the mark on her forehead said. She would not know until she was at the Harlow estate, until she had been there several days, until she heard it from a source she did not expect. It was Oliver, the stable hand, who told her. He did not mean to. He was not unkind about it. He was leaving the kitchen one afternoon, a week after her arrival, and he paused at the door and said, without looking at her directly, "For what it's worth, I've seen that mark, the word they wrote. It isn't true." She looked at him. "What word?" she said. He told her. She said nothing for a moment. She felt something move through her. Not pain exactly. It was past pain now. But a kind of vast and very quiet anger that settled in her chest like a stone settling to the bottom of deep water. It did not move her face. It simply sat there, weighty and still. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He nodded and left. She stood at the kitchen table for a long time. Around her, the sounds of the house continued, ordinary and unhurried. Someone in the corridor, the fire in the stove, birds outside the window. The world did not adjust itself for what she had just learned. It kept moving at its own pace. That was fine. She was used to that. She thought about Louise. She thought about what it took to do what Louise had done. Not just the action itself, which was cruel enough, but the planning behind it, the deliberate selection of a word, the heating of something sharp enough to leave a mark, the waiting until the right moment. That was not impulsive. That was something Louise had thought about and decided to do, for a reason Mei Lin would likely never fully understand, and that Louise herself might not have been able to fully explain. She had been sent away, with a word on her forehead. She had no way to remove it yet. It was still healing, and it would leave a mark even after it healed, pale and thin, but there. She would wear it to every room she walked into. She would wear it when she met people for the first time. She would wear it when she went to the market, or sat in a kitchen, or stood in a hallway. But she had also survived 8 years in a house that found no value in her, and she had come out of those 8 years with her mind intact and her character intact and her notebook full of things she had noticed that were true and good and interesting. She had come to a new place and had been given a job to do and had done it very well. She had been welcomed, quietly, by the man who owned this house. She had been treated with ordinary decency by Clara, who had asked if her forehead hurt and been sorry when Mei Lin said it had. She could not control what had been written on her skin. She could not erase it with her hands, but she had, in her quiet way, already begun to write something else in the place she actually lived, which was not her forehead, but her mind, and her work, and the careful attention she paid to everything around her. She picked up the cloth she had been using to dry dishes, and went back to work. That evening, after supper, she asked Clara quietly if she could borrow a small piece of glass, a mirror shard, something she could use to look at her own forehead clearly. Clara looked at her with that warm, worried expression she carried easily. "I have a small mirror," she said. "You can keep it." "I don't need to keep it," Mei Lin said. "I only want to see clearly." Clara brought the mirror. It was 3 inches by 3 inches, slightly spotted at one edge. Mei Lin took it to the window in the good afternoon light and looked at herself. The mark was above her right brow, about 1 inch long, a character pressed into the skin with something narrow and heated. The skin around it was still slightly raised and pink at the edges. She looked at the shape of it, the specific character, and she held its meaning in her mind for a long moment, looking at it with the same steady attention she gave everything. Then she put the mirror down and gave it back to Clara. "Thank you," she said. Clara looked at her carefully. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Mei Lin said, and she meant it, not in the sense that nothing was wrong, but in the sense that she was still herself, still upright, still present, still capable of the next moment, and the one after that. That was enough. She folded the damp cloth neatly and set it on the rack to dry, and she sat down at the table, where she kept the household ledger, and she opened it to the current week and began to work through the numbers with the same precise attention she always gave them, because the numbers needed to be right, and she was the one who was going to make sure they were. The question came on the 14th day. Mei Lin had been keeping track, not obsessively, but with the quiet attention she kept for most things. 14 days since the cart had dropped her at the iron gate. 14 mornings of waking before the birds. 14 evenings of working through the household ledger until the numbers were clean and certain. 14 days of learning the rhythms of a house that was very different from the last one. Quieter, steadier, less like a storm pretending to be a home. She had learned a great deal in those 14 days. She had learned that Mrs. Dunn ate a plain biscuit with her morning tea, and was in a better disposition before noon than after it. She had learned that Oliver arrived in the kitchen at 7, and again at 4, and that he drank his tea standing up because he preferred it, and that he was the most observant person in the house, though he spoke the least. She had learned that Clara was kind but also somewhat frightened of conflict and would go very quiet in the presence of anyone who raised their voice, which told Mei Lin something about Clara's history that Clara had never spoken of directly. She had learned that the east wing of the house where she slept was colder than the rest of the house, not because of any deficiency in the structure, but because of how the wind came off the open fields to the north and found the gaps around the older windows there. She had learned something about Edward Harlow too, though she had spoken to him only once. She had learned him through the house, the way you learn people through the spaces they create and maintain. The library was the most honest room in the house. Books arranged not for show but for use. Some of them pulled slightly out from their shelves, as if they had been recently returned, and not quite pushed all the way back. Margins, she had noticed through the open door, were sometimes marked with pencil, which meant he read with a pen or pencil in hand, which meant he was not reading to say he had read, but reading to think. The desk in the study had papers on it that were organized, but not static. They changed position between days, which meant they were being worked through. He ran his estate from this house, not from a city office, and he did it daily, not in bursts. He was a man who paid attention to things. She had concluded this without much data, and she knew the conclusion was preliminary, but the house supported it. Attentive people create ordered spaces, not for appearances, but because disorder costs them too much thinking energy. On the 14th morning, she was in the corridor outside the study, bringing the ledger back from Mrs. Dunn after a review, when she heard the Duke's voice from inside. He was speaking to someone, and the door was not fully closed. She was not trying to listen. She was simply present in the corridor when the door shifted and his voice became audible. "Send the information back through Marsh," he was saying, "and tell him I will need the full accounting by the end of the month, not a summary, the full accounting." A pause, then, "No. That arrangement is not satisfactory. We do not continue with what is not satisfactory simply because changing it is inconvenient." Another pause. Then his voice quieter. "That is exactly the kind of thinking I am asking you to stop." Then footsteps, and Mei-Lin moved quickly down the corridor, so she would not be standing outside the door when it opened. She had not been listening with intention, but she had heard, and what she heard stayed with her. He did not continue with what was not satisfactory, simply because changing it was inconvenient. That was not a small thing. She had lived for 8 years in a house that had continued with a great many unsatisfactory things, simply because changing them was inconvenient. She had been one of those things. She thought about this while she was working. She thought about it without letting it distract her from the work, the way she thought about most things, in the quiet background of her mind, while the foreground stayed focused on what was in front of her. At 10:30, Mrs. Dunn came into the pantry where Mei-Lin was working and said, without preamble, "The Duke will see the household ledger himself this week. He does this quarterly. You will bring it to the study at 11. Mei-Lin looked up. "The current version?" she said. "Yes," Mrs. Dunn said. "I will need 20 minutes to complete the current entries," Mei-Lin said, "so that what he sees is the full picture." Mrs. Dunn looked at her for a moment. "Then complete them," she said. Mei-Lin worked through the remaining entries with precise speed, not rushing in a way that created errors, but moving without pause. She knew this ledger well by now. She had rebuilt it from March and carried it forward daily, and the numbers were clean, and the organization was clear, and she was confident in what it showed. She carried it to the study at 11 o'clock exactly and knocked on the door. "Come in," said the Duke. The study was a working room, not a display room. There were papers on the desk, several stacks, each clearly distinct from the others. Bookshelves here too, these ones with volumes that looked more technical, accounts, maps, agricultural texts, the literature of a man who managed a large property seriously. The window behind the desk looked out onto the east grounds, the bare gardens and the fields beyond, and the light that came through it was clear and white with the season. He was sitting at the desk when she came in. He looked up immediately. She placed the ledger on the desk, on the clear space at its edge that seemed to be intended for exactly that purpose. "The household accounts," she said, "current through this morning." He nodded and opened it. She waited. She stood with her hands quiet at her sides, and her posture straight, not stiff, just collected. And she waited, while he turned pages. He read the way she thought he might, methodically, his eyes moving down each column, and then back, pausing at certain entries. He did not read to appear to read. He actually read it. After several minutes, he said, without looking up, "These corrections here, going back to March, who made them?" "I did," she said. "The previous entries were incorrect?" "There were consistent small errors in addition," she said. "I corrected them when I reorganized the records." He looked up then. He looked at her directly. "Were you asked to correct them?" "No," she said. "But they were wrong. I thought it was better to fix them." He held her gaze for a moment. "You were right," he said. "Incorrect records create compounding errors." He turned another page. "You organized the suppliers by invoice date and by category," she said. "Household, maintenance, and staffing are separated. I thought it would be easier to review the categories individually, particularly when comparing against the previous quarter." He turned to the section she meant. She could see that he was comparing, running his eye across months. "Where is the comparison?" he said. "On the facing page," she said. "The quarterly summary on the right, the previous quarter on the left." He turned to it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed the ledger, not abruptly, but with a kind of deliberate care that she recognized as the handling of something he considered well done. "You set this up yourself?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You have formal training in accounts?" "No," she said. "I learned from books and from practice." He considered this. "Mrs. Dunn did not tell me you had this capability," he said. "Mrs. Dunn did not know the extent of it," Mei Lin said. "She gave me the ledger because it needed to be caught up, and she did not know what she was asking. I did not tell her what I found, only that it was done." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but something in the vicinity of it, a kind of recognition. "You are saying she underestimated what she was giving you." "I am saying she gave me what I needed," Mei Lin said. "The result is the same." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. Then he said, "Your name is Mei Lin." "Yes," she said. He said nothing more. He picked up a pen from the desk and made a small note on a sheet of paper beside him, a single line that she could not read from where she stood. Then he said, "Thank you. That will be all." She nodded and turned to leave. She was at the door when he spoke again. "Miss Lin," he said. She turned. He was looking at her now, with an expression that was careful and direct. The look of a man who has decided to say something he has been considering. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that there is no correct answer. I am asking because I genuinely want to know." She waited. "The mark on your forehead," he said. "How did it come to be there?" The room was very quiet. The light from the window was steady and white. She could hear, very faintly, the sound of someone in the corridor outside, footsteps passing and then gone. She had been asked about the mark before, or nearly asked. Clara had asked if it hurt. Oliver had told her what it said. Mrs. Dunn had looked at it and said nothing. But no one had asked this question, exactly this question. Not how did it happen, but how did it come to be there, which was a larger question. A question that included not just the act, but everything before and behind it. She looked at him, and she decided something in that moment. She decided to answer. "I was in the house of my aunt," she said. "I had lived there for 8 years after my father died, and left debts. My aunt took me in, because refusing would have looked badly. She did not take me in out of kindness. I worked in the house as a servant, without being called one. On the night before I was sent here, one of her daughters pressed something heated against my forehead while I was in the corridor. I did not know what the word was until I was told here." She said all of this in the same quiet, even tone she used for almost everything, not because she felt nothing, but because she had long since learned to separate what she felt from how she chose to present it. The feeling was there, underneath the words, but the words stood on their own. He listened without interrupting. He held very still while she spoke, the pen still in his hand, forgotten. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted several seconds. Then he said, very quietly, "Who did it?" It was not the question she expected. She had expected something else, she was not sure what. Some expression of sympathy perhaps, or some comment about how unfortunate it was, or even nothing, simply a nod of acknowledgement and then dismissal. She had not expected that question, stated so precisely, with so much weight in it. Not what happened, not that is terrible, not, I am sorry. Who did it? Her name is Louise Alderton, Mei Lin said. She is my aunt's younger daughter. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked down at the desk, at the sheet of paper where he had made his note. He was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are thinking something through completely. Not in stages, but all at once. Then he looked up at her. "Thank you for telling me," he said. It was the same thing she had said to Oliver. "Thank you for telling me." She heard it with a recognition that settled somewhere between her ribs. "Thank you for asking," she said, genuinely. He nodded. She turned and left. In the corridor, she walked back toward the kitchen, with her usual unhurried pace, and her usual straight posture. But inside, something had shifted, something small and significant, like a door, somewhere inside her, that had been stuck for a very long time moving, just slightly, on its hinge. She had been asked, he had actually asked, not to satisfy curiosity, not to have something to say, but because he genuinely wanted to know. She had spoken and he had listened with his full attention, the kind of attention that requires stillness and patience, and a willingness to hear what is actually being said, rather than what you expect to hear. She had not been seen like that in a very long time. She thought about this while she made tea in the kitchen. She thought about it while she sat at the small table with the mug in her hands and the steam rising. Clara came in and began preparing something on the far counter, and they did not speak, which was fine, which was comfortable, because the silence in this kitchen was a different kind of silence from the silence in the Alderton house. That silence had been made of indifference. This one had more room in it. What she did not know, sitting with her tea in the warm kitchen, was that Edward Harlow was still in his study. He was sitting at his desk with the household ledger in front of him, but he was not looking at it. He was looking at the window, at the pale winter light on the bare fields beyond the glass, and he was thinking about what she had told him, about the shape of it, about what it meant that a young woman had spent 8 years working without acknowledgement in a house that traded her like an object and sent her away with a word on her forehead, and had arrived here and in 14 days had rebuilt the household accounting system from the ground up without being asked, and had stood in his study and answered his questions with more composure and directness than most of the men who came to discuss business with him. He was thinking about the word they had put on her forehead. He was also thinking about who put it there. He picked up his pen and wrote something on the sheet of paper in front of him. Then he folded the paper and set it aside and returned to the work on his desk. But the folded paper stayed at the edge of his field of vision while he worked, a small, precise note that he had written in full knowledge of what he intended to do with it. He was not a man who let things that were not satisfactory continue, simply because changing them was inconvenient. He was also not a man who moved quickly when the situation called for patience. He had learned, through experience and through some hard lessons earlier in his life, that the actions that matter most are the ones taken after full understanding and careful thought. Impulsive justice is often not justice at all. It is simply a different kind of disorder. So he folded the paper and set it aside and continued his work. But he did not forget it. He would not forget it. He was not built for forgetting the things that mattered. Outside the window, the light shifted as a cloud moved across the pale winter sun. The bare fields went darker and then lighter again. In the kitchen at the other end of the house, Mei Lin set down her empty mug and picked up the afternoon's invoices from the stack Mrs. Dunn had left for her, and she opened her notebook beside them, and she began to work through the numbers with the same careful attention she always gave them, her pen moving steadily down the page, her mind clear and present and focused on what was in front of her. She had lived her whole adult life knowing that the world placed a very low value on her. She was not certain that had changed. She was not the kind of person who drew large conclusions from small pieces of evidence. But something had happened in that study, something that felt like the beginning of a change in the weather. She could not name it exactly. She was not ready to name it. She kept the feeling the way she kept most important things, quietly and carefully, in a place inside her that was her own. William Marsh received the letter on a Thursday morning. He was a man in his early 60s, broad in the shoulders, with a face that had long ago settled into an expression of permanent mild calculation. He was not a bad man in the simple sense of the word. He was the kind of man who had spent 40 years making arrangements between people, connecting those who had something to offer with those who needed what was being offered, and he had done it with enough skill that many people in the county considered him a useful friend. He was useful. That was an accurate word for him. He had made himself into a tool that other people reached for when they needed something done quietly. The letter was from Edward Harlow's estate. This was not unusual. Marsh had been one of the estate's business contacts for several years, handling certain correspondence and contract matters. But the letter that arrived on Thursday was not about business in the usual sense. It was short and very clear, which was how the Duke wrote when he wanted something specific rather than when he was being courteous. The letter said, "I am writing to request the full details of the arrangement made between your office and the Alderton household regarding the placement of a Miss Mei Lin at this estate. I require this information in full, including the nature of the debt involved, the terms as understood by all parties, and the names of all individuals who participated in the arrangement. This is not a request made for purposes of reproach. I am asking because I intend to have a complete picture of a situation that involves someone now in my household." William Marsh read the letter twice. Then he set it down on his desk and looked at the wall for a moment. He had been in enough delicate arrangements over the years to recognize when one of them was being opened up for examination. The Alderton matter had been straightforward enough at the time, the kind of small arrangement he made regularly, a debt, a connection, a person placed where they could be useful to someone who had influence. He had not thought very much about Mei Lin as a person. He had thought about the arrangement as a transaction, which was how he thought about almost everything. The girl was capable. He had been assured of that. The Duke's household needed capable staff. It had seemed neat enough. But now the Duke was asking questions. And the Duke was not the kind of man who asked questions he did not intend to act on. Marsh picked up his pen and began to write a reply. He was careful with the reply. He included what he knew and what he had been told, without embellishing and without minimizing. He described the debt Charles Alderton had incurred and the circumstances around it. He described the conversation with Francis Alderton and the terms as he understood them. He wrote it factually, because he was genuinely a factual man, and because he understood that giving the Duke an incomplete picture would be worse, in the long run, than giving him the full one. He sealed the reply and sent it the same afternoon. Meanwhile, in the Alderton house, Francis was moving through the days after Mei Lin's departure, with the smooth efficiency of a person who has removed something that was bothering her. The house was quieter. She noted this in the way a person notes the cessation of a low noise they had almost stopped hearing. The rooms she had assigned to Mei Lin were still empty. She had not yet decided what to do with them, but the kitchen ran a little less smoothly, which was a minor inconvenience she absorbed with her usual pragmatic adjustment. Charles had brought in a girl from the village to help with the heavier work, and Francis paid her a small wage, which she found more irritating than it should have been, because the wage was a cost that Mei Lin had never represented. Patricia was occupied with her own life. She was spending considerable time with a young man named Henry Graves, from a family of reasonable standing, and Francis approved of him enough to encourage the situation, without being obvious about it. Patricia was not naturally perceptive, but she was reasonably sensible in the way that a person can be sensible without being particularly thoughtful, and she was progressing toward an arrangement that would settle her life comfortably. Francis was pleased with this. Louise was quieter than usual. Francis noticed this, but did not question it immediately. Louise had moods, she always had, and the moods came and went with a rhythm Francis had long since learned not to interrogate too directly. If she pushed, Louise closed up entirely. If she waited, Louise usually came around to what was bothering her on her own terms. So Francis waited. On the third day after Mei Lin's departure, Louise came to the sitting room where Francis was reading, and sat down in the chair across from her. She sat with her hands in her lap and her posture too straight, which was the way she sat when she was carrying something. "Is the girl settled at Harlow's?" Louise said. "I would assume so," Francis said, not looking up from her book. "Why?" "No reason," Louise said. Francis looked up at her then. "Louise." "I was just wondering," Louise said. "She is there," Francis said. "She is working. The matter is resolved." She paused. "Why are you wondering?" Louise looked away toward the window. "I may have done something," she said, before she left. Francis was still. "What did you do?" Louise told her. Not all of it. She was vague about the precise tool she had used, but the shape of it, the mark she had made on Mei Lin's forehead, before the girl left, the word she had chosen. She told it with her eyes toward the window, in the flat tone of someone who had been telling the story to herself for several days, and was now releasing it to someone else. When she finished, Francis was quiet for a long moment. "Did anyone see you?" Francis said. "No," Louise said. "It was before 5 in the morning." "Did she make a sound?" "She pulled away," Louise said, but she did not shout. Francis considered this. "She would not have," she said, more to herself than to Louise. She put her book down on the table beside her, aligned its spine with the edge. "You were foolish," she said. "I know," Louise said. "Not because of what you did," Francis said, in the same precise, cold voice she used for corrections, "but because you did it in a way that she would carry with her. Marks like that do not stay quiet. They get noticed. And now, she is in a house with a man who has influence, and who is, by all accounts, someone who pays attention to things." Louise was very still. "You think he will notice?" "He will have noticed already," Francis said. "The question is, whether he will do anything about it." "What could he do?" Louise said. Her voice had a slight tremor in it now that she was trying to suppress. "I do not know," Francis said. She picked up her book again. But you should have thought of that before. She opened to her page. Go and do something useful, she said. Louise stood and left the room. Frances read her book, or appeared to read it. Her eyes moved across the lines, but she was not taking them in. She was thinking about the Harlow estate, and what a careful, influential man might do when he noticed that the young woman working in his household had a word pressed into her forehead that she had carried with her from her previous house. She was thinking about all the things she had done in her life that had been carefully managed, the appearances she had maintained, the arrangements she had constructed, the careful distance she had kept between what the world saw of the Alderton family and what actually happened inside it. She was thinking about how long a person could maintain that distance when someone with the right kind of attention began to close it. She told herself that it would come to nothing. The Duke was a busy man. He ran an estate and several businesses. A girl with a mark on her forehead was not his concern. He would observe it and file it away and move on to the things that actually occupied his days. She told herself this. She was not entirely certain she believed it. Across the county, at the Harlow estate, Mei Lin was learning something new. It was not a thing she had been taught or shown. It was something she was discovering through the experience of being, for the first time in a very long time, in a place where her capability was actually being used. Mrs. Dunn had given her the quarterly review to prepare. This was a larger task than the weekly accounts. It involved pulling together data from several sources: the household accounts, the estate maintenance records, the supplier invoices, the staffing costs, and presenting them in a form that gave a clear picture of where money had moved and why. It was the kind of task that required not just accuracy but judgment, the ability to look at numbers and understand the story they were telling. Mei Lin worked on it for 3 days, systematically and without needing to be redirected. She asked 2 questions of Mrs. Dunn, both of them precise, and about specific facts she needed, rather than about how to proceed. She organized the material into a structure that moved from the broadest picture to the narrowest detail, so that a person could read it at whatever level of depth suited them. On the 3rd evening, when she was reviewing what she had put together, she realized something. The estate was spending more than it needed to on supplies from a particular merchant because the contract had been set up years ago at terms that no longer reflected current prices. The comparison was right there in the numbers if you knew what to look for. The overspend was not enormous, but it was consistent and it was cumulative. She noted it in the margin of the quarterly report with a small, clear annotation. She almost didn't. It was not, strictly speaking, her job to notice this. She had been asked to organize and present the numbers, not to analyze them. But she had noticed it, and it was true, and it seemed wrong not to say so when the truth was sitting there on the page. She brought the completed report to Mrs. Dunn the following morning. Mrs. Dunn read it. She read it more slowly than she had read the ledger. When she reached the annotated section, she stopped. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Mei Lin. "You identified this yourself?" she said. "It was in the numbers," Mei Lin said. "I thought it was worth noting." Mrs. Dunn looked at the annotation again. "This represents a significant savings if it is corrected," she said. "Over 2 years, approximately," Mei Lin said, and named the figure she had calculated. Mrs. Dunn set the report down. Her expression was that of a person who has had an assumption quietly dismantled and is taking a moment to rebuild it on new ground. "I will bring this to the Duke," she said. "As you see fit," Mei Lin said. She went back to the kitchen. She made tea and sat with it for a while, listening to the sounds of the house. Oliver came in at 4 o'clock for his afternoon tea. He stood at the counter with his mug, as always, and they did not speak at first, because neither of them felt the need to fill silence with words. After a few minutes, he said, without turning around, "Mrs. Dunn looks like she's been handed a puzzle she didn't ask for." Mei Lin looked at his back. "I may have given her one," she said. Oliver made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the closest thing to it that he seemed to possess. He finished his tea, set his mug on the counter, and went back out without another word. Clara came in later, in the early evening, and sat at the table across from Mei Lin, with the comfortable ease of someone settling into a familiar place. She had flour on her hands, from the baking she'd been doing in the other room. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said. "Yes," Mei Lin said. "Are you happy here?" Clara asked. Then she seemed to realize how the question sounded, or how large it was, and she added quickly, "I mean, compared to before." Maylin thought about this honestly. I am less unhappy, she said, which is a significant improvement. Clara nodded slowly, processing this. That's not the same as happy. No, Maylin said, but it is a start. Clara looked at her carefully with that open, worried face of hers. You deserve more than a start, she said. And then, as if she had surprised herself with the directness of it, she stood up and went to wash her hands at the sink. Maylin watched her go. She thought about what Clara had said. She thought about it the way she thought about things that were true, and that she had needed to hear, carefully and with full attention. She had not known, until these 2 weeks at this house, how much weight she had been carrying from 8 years, in a place that had never once thought about what she deserved. The weight had become so familiar, it felt like her own body. She had stopped thinking of it as a burden. She had just thought of it as herself. But now, in this quieter house, with these smaller kindnesses from Clara and Oliver, and even from the composed, deliberate attention of the Duke himself, she could feel the difference. She could feel the weight for what it was, separate from herself, something she had been carrying that was not hers. She did not know yet how to set it down. That was not the kind of thing you learned in 2 weeks. But she was beginning to know what it felt like to have it noted, to have someone acknowledge that it was there, and that it was heavy, and that she was the one who had been carrying it, not because she deserved to, but simply because no one else had been willing to. That evening, before she slept, she opened her notebook and wrote 3 lines. Not about feelings. About what she had noticed that day, the light through the kitchen window at 4 o'clock, the way Oliver's footsteps on the gravel sounded different in cold air than in warm, the precise figure of the estate's overspend on supplies, which was a number, but which was also a truth she had found, where no one else had thought to look. She closed the notebook and put it back in its place, and lay down in the narrow bed and listened to the house make its nighttime sounds. She felt, for the first time in a long time, like herself. The letter from William Marsh arrived on a Monday. Edward Harlow read it at his desk in the early morning, before the rest of the house was fully awake, with a cup of tea going cold at his elbow, and the winter light beginning to grow at the east window. He read it twice, which was his habit with anything important, the first time for the content, and the second time for the structure of it, for what was emphasized, and what was minimized, and what was left out. Marsh was a man who organized information in a particular way, and learning to read that organization told you as much as the information itself. What the letter contained was this: Charles Alderton had borrowed significant money from 3 creditors and been unable to repay it after an investment through a supplier named Gerald Holt failed. The amount was named. It was not a small amount. Francis Alderton had approached William Marsh through their existing connection and proposed the arrangement, framing it as a placement of a capable household worker at the Harlow estate, in exchange for Marsh's assistance in managing the exposure of the debt through his connections. The daughter in question, Maylin, was described in the letter as the daughter of Francis Alderton's brother, who had died some years prior. The arrangement had been understood as a mutual benefit, a capable worker, placed where she would be well treated, a difficult financial situation handled without public incident. Marsh wrote that he had understood it to be that. He had not made further inquiry into the conditions of Maylin's life in the Alderton household. He had understood her to be a member of the family. Edward set the letter down. He picked up his tea. It was cold. He set it back down. He had known, from the moment he read Maylin's expression in his study when she told him what had been done, that the situation was worse than a simple domestic dispute between cousins. He had known it from the way she told it, not with the drama of a person trying to draw sympathy, but with the flat, detailed accuracy of a person reporting events they have had a long time to process and categorize. That kind of telling is specific to people who have had to organize their own painful history somewhere where it could not continue to damage them. It was the telling of someone who had carried a thing for a very long time. He had not known the financial structure behind it. Now he did. He also now understood clearly what had been traded. Maylin had not been placed with him as an act of family concern. She had been traded in settlement of a debt that was not hers. She had been the only thing the Aldertons had that they were willing to give up without it costing them something they valued. He thought about this for a long time, sitting at the desk in the growing morning light. He was not given to strong emotional reactions, or rather, he was given to them inwardly, while remaining outwardly composed. This was not a quality he had cultivated deliberately. It was simply how he was built. Strong feeling did not make him louder or more reactive. It made him quieter and more deliberate. The strongest anger he had ever felt had expressed itself as a very careful decision, made at considerable patience, executed with precise timing. The people he had been angry at had often not known he was angry at all until the consequence arrived. He thought about Charles Alderton and his bad investments and his borrowed money, and his wife, who had looked at the human being in her care and calculated her against a debt. He thought about the particular quality of that calculation, the ease of it, the way it assumed that the girl in question did not have sufficient standing to protest or to matter. He thought about what 8 years of that assumption would do to a person who was experiencing it daily. He thought about what it would do to your understanding of your own worth, to be surrounded by people who measured your value and found it exactly low enough to be convenient. He thought about what it took to emerge from that, with the posture and the composure and the precise, unsentimental intelligence that he had observed in Mei Lin across 3 weeks. He thought about the kind of internal resources a person would have to build and maintain and protect, to remain fundamentally themselves through that kind of sustained erosion. He thought about Louise Alderton, who was 17 years old and who had taken something sharp and heated and pressed a word into a sleeping girl's skin the night before she was sent away. He was very still thinking about Louise Alderton. Then he picked up his pen and began to write. The first letter went to his solicitor, a man named Arthur Penfield in the city. It was a precise letter asking for a specific piece of legal research, the obligations of a household that takes in a minor dependent at the death of that dependent's parent, the rights of that dependent regarding any arrangements made on their behalf, and the legal standing of any financial arrangement that trades a person's labor in settlement of a debt without that person's informed consent. The second letter went to his contact in the local magistrate's office. This was a more careful letter, less direct, the kind that opens a line of inquiry without stating its purpose explicitly. He asked about Gerald Holt, the supplier at the center of Charles Alderton's bad investment, and whether the man's activities in the county were under any kind of examination. The third letter was to William Marsh. It thanked him for his response, acknowledged his description of the arrangement, and asked one further question: whether the name of the mark made on Mei Lin's forehead before her departure had been known to any party in the arrangement, and if so, to whom. He sealed all 3 letters and set them aside for dispatch. Then he went to breakfast, because skipping breakfast was not something he considered worth doing, and because the work of the day was going to require a steady mind. He passed Mei Lin in the corridor on the way to the dining room. She was carrying a stack of organized invoices, walking with her usual composed efficiency. She looked up when she saw him, and there was a brief, uncomplicated exchange of acknowledgement, a look between 2 people who have spoken honestly to each other and feel, in the other's presence, the particular ease that honesty creates. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, sir," she said. He continued to the dining room. She continued toward the pantry. Neither of them stopped. But something moved in the house between them at that moment, something that had been building quietly across 3 weeks, without either of them naming it, the recognition of a particular kind of mutual regard, not romantic, not formal, but real, the regard that exists between 2 people who have each, in their separate ways, decided that the other one is worth taking seriously. Mei Lin did not know about the letters. She did not know that the Duke had been quietly building a full picture of what had brought her to his house. She knew only that she had been asked, that she had answered, and that he had listened. She had not expected action to follow that listening. She had been in enough situations in her life where listening led to nothing, where a person heard and nodded and then moved on to what they actually cared about. She was not assuming this was different, but she was noticing things, small things, the kind of small things she noticed about everything. She noticed that Mrs. Dunn had adjusted the household ledger system to match the format Mei Lin had established, without being asked and without mentioning it. She noticed that the quarterly report she had completed was no longer on Mrs. Dunn's desk, but had moved, which meant it had been given to someone. She noticed that Oliver had, without comment, begun addressing her as Miss Lin when he came into the kitchen for his tea, which he had not done before. None of these things were evidence of anything specifically. She filed them and continued working. On the 21st day, she was summoned to the study again. She brought nothing with her this time. The summons had not specified a reason, and she had learned from the first meeting that the Duke preferred directness over assumption. She would wait to be told why she had been called before preparing anything. He was standing when she entered, which she had not expected. He was at the window, looking out at the grounds, and he turned when she came in. He looked tired in a particular way, not from lack of sleep, but from the kind of sustained, careful thinking that costs something. "Please sit down," he said. She sat in the chair across from the desk. He did not sit immediately. He remained standing at the window for a moment, and she waited. "I want to be transparent with you," he said. He turned to face her. "I have been gathering information about the arrangement that brought you here. I believe you deserve to know that, and to know what I have found." She looked at him steadily. "All right," she said. He told her what William Marsh's letter had contained. He told her the amount of the debt, the nature of the arrangement, the parties involved. He told her it clearly, and without softening it, which she appreciated more than softening would have given her. She sat and listened. She felt the information settle into her understanding of her own story, confirming things she had partly known, and naming things she had only sensed. It was not a shock. It was a completion. "I suspected the financial element," she said, when he had finished. "I did not know the specifics." "Does it change how you see what happened?" he asked. She thought about this. "It confirms that I was not the reason," she said. "I knew that, but knowing the mechanism makes it easier to hold. It was not about me personally. It was about what I could be used for. That is a different thing." He looked at her for a long moment. "You have a very precise way of understanding things," he said. "I have had a great deal of time to practice," she said. He sat down then, across from her, not behind the desk, but in the other chair, the one beside the fireplace. It was a smaller gesture than it probably appeared to him, but it was significant to her, the choice to be beside her, rather than across from her. "I want to tell you what I intend to do," he said, "and I want to ask if you have any objection to it." She said nothing, waiting. "The arrangement by which you were sent here was not one you consented to," he said. "You were traded against a debt that was not yours. That is not something I am willing to be a participant in. I intend to have it examined formally." She was very still. "Formally," she said. "Through the appropriate channels," he said. "My solicitor is researching the legal dimensions. The debt the Aldertons had will not be resolved through you. It will need to be resolved some other way, which is their problem to manage, not yours." She thought about this carefully. "What happens to me?" she said, not as a demand, as a genuine question about her own position. "That is what I want to ask you about," he said. "You have been here for 3 weeks. You have done work that is well above what was expected, and that this household needs. I would like you to stay." He paused. "Not as a girl placed here to settle someone else's debt. As a member of the household staff, properly employed and properly paid, with the work defined by what you are actually capable of." She looked at him. In her experience, offers that came from people with power had conditions attached, sometimes spoken, sometimes not. She had learned to look for the conditions. "What would the work be?" she said. "Managing the household accounts and the quarterly reports," he said, "with the authority to make corrections and adjustments as you see fit, and to bring any concerns directly to me. Mrs. Dunn will retain her overall management of the house, but the financial records will be yours." She thought about this. She thought about it honestly, and without the performance of gratitude or the performance of suspicion. "I have one question," she said. "Ask it," he said. "Will the arrangement be clear to everyone in the house, what my role is, and on what terms I am here?" He met her eyes. "Yes," he said, "completely clear." She was quiet for a moment. "Then I would like to stay," she said. He nodded. And then something happened that she had not seen from him before. His expression, which was usually composed and careful, shifted to something warmer, something that was not quite a smile, but was unmistakably genuine. "Good," he said, and that single word contained something she was not expecting. She stood and thanked him and went back to the kitchen. She sat at the table for a long while after, her hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing in particular. Clara came in and looked at her face and said nothing, just went to put the kettle on, which was the right thing to do. When the tea was made, she set a mug in front of Mei Lin and sat across from her. "Well?" Clara said. "I am staying," Mei Lin said, "properly." Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that doesn't need anything added to it. "Good," she said. Arthur Penfield was the kind of solicitor who had seen everything and been surprised by very little of it. He was in his mid-50s, lean and long-fingered, with reading glasses he kept on the end of his nose, and a mind that processed legal complexity, the way a mill processes grain, thoroughly and without wasted motion. He had worked for Edward Harlow's family for over a decade, first for Edward's father, and then for Edward himself, and he had come to understand his client's particular mode of operation: the careful information gathering, the deliberate timing, the preference for action that was complete rather than hasty. When the letter came from the estate, Penfield read it and understood immediately that Edward was not engaged in an idle inquiry. He was building something. He began the research the same afternoon. The law on the point Edward had asked about was not immediately clear, because the law on such points rarely was. There were several relevant doctrines. There was the question of guardianship obligations, which arose when a minor child was placed in the care of a relative following a parent's death. There was the question of what obligations that guardianship carried, which included, among other things, the requirement that any financial arrangements involving the dependent be made in that dependent's interests and not against them. There was the further question of whether an arrangement that effectively placed a dependent in service elsewhere in settlement of the guardian's own debts met any legal definition of recognized obligations. Penfield was not certain it constituted anything with a formal name in law, but he was fairly certain it constituted something that a magistrate would find worth examining, particularly given the additional element of the physical harm that had been done to the young woman before her departure. That element was cleaner. That element had a name. He wrote his response to the Duke over 2 days, carefully, with footnotes to the relevant doctrines, and a clear summary of what he believed was actionable and what was not. He sent it, and then he waited, because in his experience of Edward Harlow, the next step would come quickly, and it would be very specific. In the Alderton house, the weeks after Maylin's departure had settled into a surface routine that covered a growing unease. Frances went about her days with her usual controlled efficiency, managing the house, managing Patricia's prospects with Henry Graves, attending the social occasions she attended. She was very good at surface. She had been practicing it for decades. But underneath the surface, she was watching for signs. The signs she was watching for were contact from the Harlow estate. She had told herself it would not come. She had told herself that the Duke was a busy man, and that a girl with a mark on her forehead was a minor matter. But she had not entirely convinced herself, because she knew from their single meeting at a county function 3 years prior, that Edward Harlow had a particular quality that she found, in retrospect, more significant than she had given it credit for at the time. He had been introduced to her at the function, and they had spoken briefly, pleasantries and a short exchange about something in the county news she could not now recall. What she remembered was his eyes, not unkind eyes, but very still, the eyes of a man who was watching and absorbing and forming opinions without announcing them. She had found him pleasant and unremarkable and moved on. Now she understood what that stillness was. Louise was the outward sign of the inward unease. She had become quieter than usual, which for Louise was very quiet. She had stopped making comments at dinner, stopped picking at things, stopped filling the rooms with her usual low-grade restlessness. She ate, and was polite, and helped when asked, and retreated to her room in the evenings. Frances watched her and said nothing. Charles was oblivious to all of it. Charles was always oblivious when things were difficult. It was his primary defense mechanism, and it worked consistently for him, at the cost of everyone around him. On a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after Maylin's departure, a man came to the door of the Alderton house. He was a person who delivered legal correspondence, neat and impersonal in his gray coat. He asked for Frances Alderton, and she came to the door herself, because she had been expecting something and had instructed the new girl not to turn anyone away without her knowledge. The envelope he handed her had the Penfield and Associates mark on it. She took it inside. She stood in the hallway and opened it. She read the contents once, quickly, and then sat down on the bench beside the hallway table, because her legs were not quite as steady as they should have been. The letter was from Penfield, as solicitor for the Duke of Harlow. It was formal and clear. It stated that the arrangement made between William Marsh and Frances Alderton regarding the placement of Miss Maylin was under examination, It stated that the examination was proceeding through proper channels and that the cooperation of the parties involved was requested. It asked for the full account of the financial obligations Charles Alderton had carried at the time of the arrangement, as well as a written account of the conditions under which Mei Lin had lived in the Alderton household for the preceding 8 years. It noted, at the end, with a precision that Frances felt somewhere behind her ribs, that a physical injury had been observed on Miss Lin that appeared to have been inflicted prior to her departure, and that this matter was also being examined. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Then she stood up and went to find Louise. Louise was in her room, reading. She looked up when her mother came in, and something in Frances's face made her close the book immediately. Frances sat down on the edge of the bed. She did not show Louise the letter. She simply looked at her daughter for a long moment, with an expression that Louise had rarely seen on her mother's face, something that was not anger, not frustration, but a particular kind of weariness. "He has acted," Frances said. Louise went pale. "Harlow?" "His solicitor," Frances said. "They are examining the arrangement, and they have noted the mark." Louise said nothing. Her hands were very still in her lap. "I need you to understand something," Frances said. Her voice was quiet and even. "I cannot protect you from the mark. I can manage many things. I cannot make that disappear, because it did not happen here, in this house, in private. You made it on a person, who then went to another household, one with influence, and with someone paying attention. Do you understand what that means?" Louise nodded. She was blinking quickly. "It means," Frances said, "that what you did is now witnessed by someone I cannot reach." The silence between them was heavy and complete. "What will happen?" Louise said. "I do not know exactly," Frances said, "but I know that Edward Harlow is not a man who begins something he does not finish." She stood up. She straightened her dress. She went to the door, and then stopped and turned back to her daughter. "You should have thought about where she was going," Frances said, "before you did what you did." Then she went back downstairs to write a letter to their own solicitor, because that was what you did, when trouble came, and you had been careful enough to need a lawyer and not a confession. Meanwhile, at the Harlow estate, Mei Lin was moving through her newly defined role, with the same methodical attention she had brought to everything else. The difference now was the formality of it, the clarity of what she was doing, and why, and on whose terms. She had a work table in the study adjacent to the library, a small room that had previously been used for storage of older documents. She had cleared it and organized it herself over 2 days, with Oliver's help moving the heavier shelves, and now it was a proper working space, with the ledgers arranged by year and the current accounts on the right side of the table where the light was best. She had also, at the Duke's quiet suggestion, begun to look at the estate accounts as a whole, not just the household side, but the management of the farms and the woodland and the supply contracts. It was considerably more complex than the household ledger. She found it more interesting in proportion to its complexity, which was one of the truest things about her. She worked 5 or 6 hours a day on the accounts, and spent the remaining time on other tasks Mrs. Dunn assigned. There was an equilibrium developing in the house around her, a natural settling of everyone into their positions relative to her new role. Mrs. Dunn was professional about it, in the way she was professional about everything, adjusting her system to incorporate the new arrangement without theatrics. Clara was simply Clara, warm and present, and quietly delighted that Mei Lin was staying. Oliver was as he always was, which was to say reliable and observant and completely undramatic about anything. She was eating better. This was a thing she noticed, not with emotion, but with simple physical awareness. The kitchen at the Harlow estate provided proper meals, not as a grudging cost to be minimized, but as a straightforward necessity for the people working in the house. She ate full meals at a proper table at proper times, and the improvement to how she felt physically was so gradual and so complete that she barely tracked it except in retrospect. She slept better too. Not immediately, it had taken several weeks, but now she was sleeping without waking in the night, from the low anxiety that had accompanied her for years, the background sense of uncertainty about what the next day would bring, and whether she would be able to meet its demands, without giving anyone a reason to reduce her further. The background anxiety had not disappeared entirely, but it was quieter. It was not running at full volume the way it had been. She had not spoken again to the Duke about the letters or the examination. She knew it was ongoing. She had not asked for updates. It did not feel like her place to ask, and besides, she trusted the process without needing to supervise it, which was a new kind of trust for her, and she was being careful with it. She was at her work table on a Thursday afternoon, working through a section of the estate's timber contracts, when there was a knock at the door. She looked up. It was Edward Harlow. He came in and sat in the chair he had placed against the wall of the small room, which he sometimes used when he came to discuss something she was working on. He had begun doing this over the preceding 2 weeks, coming to the working room rather than summoning her to the study, and she had noticed the difference in the dynamic it created, the implication that he was coming to where she worked, rather than calling her to where he held authority. "I have heard back from Arthur," he said. She set down her pen. "The legal position is not entirely clean," he said. "It is not clean on either side. The arrangement as it was made exists in a gray area. What is clearer is the question of the injury." She waited. "Arthur has made contact with the relevant office in the county," he said. "The question of what Louise Alderton did is being treated as a separate matter from the financial arrangement. It is straightforward as a matter of law. An injury was deliberately inflicted. There is evidence, there is a witness, being you, and there is the mark itself, which is still partially visible." She looked at him. "What will happen to her?" she said. He met her eyes. "That is not fully in my hands," he said. "It is in the hands of the magistrate's office. But what I have communicated clearly is that I will support any examination with everything I can provide." She was quiet for a moment. "She is 17, she said. "Yes," he said. He was watching her carefully. "I am not asking you to stop," she said. "I am stating a fact I want to hold in view." He nodded. "I understand." She picked up her pen again and held it without writing. "I have thought about this," she said, "about what I would want if someone asked me, and what I want is not for Louise to be destroyed. She is young, and she has been raised by a mother who models a certain kind of person, and she has never had anyone require her to be better." She paused. "But I want what she did to have a consequence. I want her to understand that what she did to me had a cost, not for revenge, because people who are never shown that their actions have consequences do not become better people." He was very still. "That is what I would want," she said, "if it matters." "It matters considerably," he said. She looked at him then, directly and without the careful distance she usually maintained. She said, "Why are you doing this? Truly, you did not have to do any of it." He looked back at her for a moment, and the composure he wore so consistently shifted just slightly, enough that she could see something underneath it, something that was not entirely calm. "Because what was done to you was wrong," he said, "and because I am in a position to do something about it. And because I have lived in a world where people in positions like mine frequently observe things that are wrong and do nothing about them because it is inconvenient, and I find that kind of inaction one of the most disappointing things a person can choose." He paused. "And because you are someone who deserved better a long time ago." The room was very quiet. She said, after a moment, "That is a very complete answer." Something moved in his expression that was definitely the vicinity of a smile. "I try to be thorough," he said. She looked down at her work. She picked up her pen and returned to the timber contracts. He sat in his chair for a few minutes more, reading something he had brought with him, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind two people can only have when they have said something real to each other and do not need to keep talking to fill the space it left. The magistrate's office sent 2 men to the Alderton house on a Tuesday in early December. They were not loud about it. That was one of the things Frances would remember afterward, how quiet it all was. She had imagined, in the weeks of waiting, that when something official arrived it would arrive with noise, raised voices, drama. It did not. The 2 men came to the door in the morning, when Charles was at his office and the house was going about its ordinary tasks. They spoke to Frances in the sitting room for 40 minutes. They were polite. They were precise. They wrote things down in small notebooks with a thoroughness that suggested they were not going to misplace any of it. They asked about the arrangement with the Harlow estate. Frances told them what she told herself, which was that it had been an opportunity for a young woman with no prospects and no position, and that she had facilitated it out of concern for Maylin's welfare. She said this with the composure she had maintained through 40 years of managing appearances, and the 2 men listened and wrote and nodded and gave nothing away. Then they asked about the mark on Maylin's forehead. Francis said she had not been aware of it before Maylin's departure. One of the men looked up from his notebook. "Were you aware after her departure?" he said. She hesitated for exactly the wrong amount of time. She said, "My daughter mentioned something to me afterward." "Which daughter?" the man said. "Louise," Francis said, and in that single word, in the act of giving a name, she understood that she had passed a particular point of no return. They asked to speak with Louise. Francis brought Louise down from her room. Louise came in and sat in the chair they indicated, and she was very pale, and her hands were together in her lap, but she was composed, because she was her mother's daughter, and she had been raised to present herself in a particular way, regardless of what was happening underneath. But Louise was also 17, and she was not, despite everything, her mother in full. She lacked the decades of practice. She lacked the absolute certainty that her own framing of events was the only valid one. She had spent the weeks since Maylin's departure in a complicated interior space that she had not discussed with anyone, turning over what she had done, and why, and what it said about her, finding the answers to those questions uncomfortable in a way she had not expected. She had expected to feel vindicated. She had felt, instead, something heavier and less clean. The two men asked her directly what she had done on the night before Maylin's departure. Louise looked at her mother. Francis's face gave her nothing. She looked back at the men, and she told them, not everything at first, but enough. And then they asked precise questions that led to more. And by the end of the 40 minutes, the notebook contained a description of what had been done, and how, and with what. When the men left, Francis sat in the sitting room for a long time. Louise stood near the door. "I told the truth," Louise said. Her voice was strange, tight, and also somehow lighter than it had been in weeks. "I know," Francis said. "Are you angry?" Francis looked at her for a moment. She thought about all the things she might say, the things she would normally say, about management and appearances, and the cost of honesty in a world that used honesty against you. She thought about Maylin's face as she had last seen it, going out the back door before dawn with her bundle and no breakfast, without a word. "No," Francis said. "I am not angry." Louise sat down in the other chair. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Why did I do it?" It was not a question she was asking Francis. It was a question she was asking herself aloud, in the way that young people sometimes do when they have been circling something privately and need to hear it spoken. Francis said nothing. "I think I knew she was better than me at things," Louise said. "Things that matter. The way she read, and the way she worked, and the way she was always so steady. I could not make her afraid of me. Nothing I said or did made her look afraid. I hated that. And I think I did it because I wanted to mark her as less, before she left, because I could feel she was going somewhere I could not follow." The room was very quiet. "That is honest," Francis said. "Is it too late for honesty to count?" Louise said. Francis considered this with more seriousness than she had considered most things in a long time. "But I think it is a better starting place than where we have been." Louise nodded slowly. They did not speak any further about it that day. But something had shifted in the house, in the particular air between them, a change in pressure. A window opened after a long time closed. Charles came home in the evening, and Francis told him what had happened. He listened with his usual expression of difficulty, and then said, "What will they do?" And she said she did not know, and he nodded, and went to his study, which was what he always did when things required him to sit with them. Francis went to bed that night with the knowledge that the shape of the coming weeks was out of her hands, which was a feeling she had spent most of her adult life engineering ways to avoid. She lay in the dark and thought about it. She thought about Maylin, not as a problem or a calculation, but as a person, perhaps for the first time with true attention. She thought about a girl of 14 arriving at her door with nothing and working for 8 years, with a consistency and a dignity that Francis had observed but never once acknowledged. She thought about the fact that in all those 8 years, she had never once asked Maylin how she was, not genuinely, not as a real question. She thought about the notebook she had seen, once, through the open door of Maylin's room, a small notebook that Maylin kept. She had not thought about it much at the time. She thought about it now. She thought about what a person puts in a notebook when they are in a house that gives them nothing, what they choose to hold on to when everything they came from has been stripped away, and she understood, lying in the dark, that the notebook was the truest picture of who Mei Lin actually was, and that Francis had never looked at it. She had lived with a person for 8 years and had never looked. She closed her eyes. The feeling that came was not comfortable, and she did not try to make it comfortable. She held it, and she let it be what it was. At the Harlow estate, Mei Lin continued her work. She had developed, over the weeks of autumn and into December, a particular rhythm in the working room. She arrived early, before most of the house was moving. She made a cup of tea in the kitchen and brought it to her table and sat for a few minutes looking at what she had been working on the previous day, gathering the thread of it, before she began. Then she worked steadily through the morning. She took her meals with the household staff in the kitchen, at the appropriate times. She worked again in the afternoon. She took a walk in the late afternoon when the light was still there, through the grounds, which she had come to know well, the kitchen garden, the edge of the home wood, the path along the old stone wall on the south side. The walks were new. She had not walked for pleasure in years. In the Alderton house, she had not had time, and she had not had the feeling of being free to go anywhere without a purpose. Here, the walk was simply a walk. She went where she wanted to go. She looked at things. She thought. It was on one of those walks, in early December with the ground cold and the sky very clear, that Edward Harlow came up beside her on the path along the stone wall. She had not heard him coming. She turned when she sensed movement, and he was there, in his coat, his hands in his pockets. "I am intruding," he said. "No," she said, meaning it. They walked in silence for a little while. The grounds were bare and precise in the winter light, the outlines of things very clear, without the softening of leaves. "The magistrate's office has completed its initial inquiry," he said. She kept walking. "And?" "The question of the arrangement is being treated as a civil matter," he said. "Arthur's view is that the structure of what the Aldertons did is actionable, but that pursuing it fully would be long and uncertain. What is certain, however, is the question of the injury." She looked at the wall as they walked beside it, the old stones fitted together with a precision that had outlasted the hands that placed them. "What does certain mean in this case?" she said. "It means that Louise Alderton will be required to appear before the magistrate," he said. "Given her age, the outcome will not be what it would be for an adult, but it will not be nothing." She was quiet for a few steps. "A consequence," she said. "A visible one," he said, "witnessed by people beyond her own household." "That is what I asked for," she said. "That is enough." He glanced at her. "You are very measured about this." "I have had a long time to decide what kind of person I want to be about difficult things," she said. "I decided some years ago that I did not want to become bitter. That bitterness would have been the most lasting damage. Not the years of work or the mark on my forehead. The bitterness, if I had let it in and kept it." She paused. "I was not always successful, but I worked at it." He walked beside her and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How did you work at it?" She thought about the question. It was the kind of question that deserved a real answer. "I wrote things down," she said. "Not the bad things. The things I noticed that were true and good. The light at certain times of day. Things I read that stayed with me. The way a person's voice changes when they are being honest rather than performing." She paused. "I gave my attention to what was real and good in the world, even when I was inside something that was neither. It kept me tethered." He listened to this with his full attention, the way he listened to everything, with a stillness that she had come to understand was not distance, but presence. "I have something similar," he said, after a moment. "Not a notebook, but the habit of attention, noticing what is actually true, as opposed to what is convenient to believe." She looked at him. "That is a harder discipline," she said. "Convenient beliefs are very comfortable." "Yes," he said, "they are." They had reached the end of the wall path. The grounds opened out ahead, into the wider fields, and the afternoon light was going golden and low in the west. "I should go in," he said. "Yes," she said. They turned back toward the house. They walked back along the wall in the low gold light, and neither of them spoke, and the silence was of the particular kind that exists between two people who have said enough real things to each other that silence itself has become a kind of conversation. At the house, they separated at the door, him to the main entrance, and she to the kitchen, and they said good night, and that was all. But something had shifted slightly in the air of that walk. something that both of them felt, and neither named. Because some things are not ready to be named yet, and need more time to become certain. Maylin went into the kitchen. Clara was there, making something on the stove that smelled of onions and winter herbs. She looked up when Maylin came in. "You've been out," Clara said. "Walking," Maylin said. Clara smiled at the pot. "Alone?" Maylin sat at the table. "No," she said. Clara kept smiling at the pot and said nothing more. She was wise enough, in her quiet way, to know when more words would only reduce something. Maylin sat with her hands on the table and looked at nothing, and felt something she had difficulty naming precisely. It was not happiness, though it was in the same territory. It was something more specific, the feeling of being in the right place. Not a perfect place, not a place without difficulty or uncertainty, but a place where she was real, where she was seen, where her mind was used and her presence was considered, and the person she had worked very hard to remain was not just tolerated, but valued. She had not been in a place like that since the small house where her father read to her by lamplight. She picked up her tea when Clara set it in front of her, and she held it in both hands and let it warm her fingers. And outside the kitchen window, the last of the afternoon light moved in the bare branches of the oak at the edge of the garden, and it was beautiful, in the quiet, specific way that things you have been too busy surviving to notice, suddenly, are when you are finally still enough to see them. The hearing for Louise Alderton was set for the 3rd week of December. It was not a grand proceeding. The magistrate's court in the county town was a room of modest size, with tall windows that let in gray winter light, and wooden benches that had been worn smooth over decades of people sitting in them, waiting for something to be decided. It was the kind of room that was honest about what it was, a place where things that could not be resolved privately were brought to be resolved with witnesses. Francis brought Louise herself. Charles offered to come, and Francis told him to stay at the office, because his presence would contribute nothing except the possibility of him saying something unhelpful under pressure. Patricia did not come either. She had been told what was happening, in broad terms, and she had listened with a quietness that suggested she was processing things more than she usually did, but she had said nothing, and Francis had not pushed. Louise dressed plainly. Francis had told her this, not as a strategy but as a matter of what was honest. Louise put on a dark coat and dark boots and wore her hair simply, and she looked, walking through the county town on that gray December morning, like someone who has aged several months in a short time. She had, in some ways, the weeks since the men from the magistrate's office had come to the house, had been a different kind of education than anything her life had previously offered. She had, in that time, been required to do something she had never been required to do before. She had been required to see herself, not through her own eyes, not through the eyes of her mother or her social circle or the mirror in her room, but through the account she had given to the magistrate's men, through hearing her own actions described back to her in the careful, neutral language of official record. What Louise Alderton did to Maylin, on the night before Maylin's departure, was described in that language clearly, heard in that form, without the surrounding noise of her own justifications and feelings. It was very clear what it was. It was something one person did to another person who had no power to stop them. It was something that could only be done to someone you had decided did not have the same standing as yourself, whose pain was not as significant as your own moment of feeling. Louise had sat with that understanding for weeks now. It was not comfortable. She was not entirely sure what to do with it. But she had not tried to put it away from herself the way she would have, 6 months ago, before all of this. She had let it stay where it was and tried to understand it more fully. She was not certain she had succeeded, but the trying itself was different from who she had been. They arrived at the magistrate's court and were shown to the waiting room. They sat for 20 minutes before being called in. The magistrate was a man in his 60s, named Mr. Alistair Ford, with a full gray beard and a quiet manner that Louise would remember afterward as the most undramatic thing about a morning she had expected to be full of drama. He asked Louise questions in a methodical way. He did not shout or press or use any of the theatrical techniques she had imagined in her nights of anticipating this. He simply asked, and she answered, and her answers were complete because she had decided, going in, that she was going to tell the complete truth. Not because she had no choice, though she largely didn't, but because she had made a private resolution, in the weeks of waiting, that she was going to stop being someone who managed the truth into a shape that served her. At the end of the questioning, Ford read from a prepared statement. He said that the deliberate infliction of a permanent mark on another person without consent was a recognized wrong. He said that the nature of the mark, a word intended to diminish, combined with the circumstances in which it was made, a person who was being sent from the household and was in no position to seek recourse, made it a more serious wrong than a spontaneous act. He said that Louise's age and the absence of any previous record were factors that shaped the response of the court. He said that the response would not be imprisonment. It would be a formal record, a required period of supervised community service under the direction of the local parish welfare office, and a letter of acknowledgement to be written by Louise to Mei Lin in terms that the court would review for sincerity and completeness. He said this last requirement quietly, and it was the one that stayed with Louise longest. Not the record, not the service, but the letter to Mei Lin that had to be real. Frances sat beside her and heard all of this without expression. She waited until they were outside on the street before she said anything. They stood on the pavement with the cold winter air moving around them, and the ordinary sounds of the town going on all around them, people and carts and the distant sound of a bell, and Frances looked at her daughter for a moment. "All right," Frances said. "All right," Louise said. It was not reconciliation, it was not resolution, it was the acknowledgement that they were still standing, and that the next thing had to be done, and that they would do it. That was enough for now. They walked back through the town toward where the coach was waiting, and they did not talk much, but the silence was different from the silence that had sat in the house for weeks. Less like a held breath, more like the beginning of exhaling. At the Harlow estate, Mei Lin did not know the specific details of what was happening at the magistrate's court that morning. She knew it was happening. She had been informed it would take place. She had not asked for reports, and none had been offered, which she appreciated. She was working at her table in the small room off the library, going through the year's end accounts, which required complete concentration, and which she gave it. The year-end accounts for the Harlow estate were significantly more complex than anything she had worked on before. They included the household accounts she had rebuilt from March, the estate farm accounts for 5 separate tenant farms, the timber management records for the home wood, several investment accounts that Penfield managed on the estate's behalf, and the records of 2 business interests the Duke held in the city. She had been working on them for 3 weeks, and she was beginning to see the whole shape of the estate's financial life clearly, a shape that was generally sound, but had several places where efficiency could be improved. She was working through the investment section when the Duke came to the doorway of her working room. She heard the familiar sound of his footstep and looked up. He looked at her for a moment from the doorway. He had a letter in his hand. "From Arthur," he said. She waited. "The hearing was this morning," he said. Louise Alderton appeared. She gave a complete account. He told her the outcome, the formal record, the community service, the letter. She listened. "The letter must be sincere," he said. "Penfield's office will review it." She thought about the letter. She thought about Louise writing it, what that would require, the particular difficulty of finding words for something you have done and cannot undo. "That is the hardest part," she said. He looked at her. "For Louise?" "For anyone," Mei Lin said. "Writing honestly about something you are ashamed of is one of the hardest things there is." She paused. "I hope she finds she can do it." He was quiet for a moment. "You hope that?" "I told you before that I did not want her destroyed," she said. "I meant it. If she writes the letter honestly, she will know herself better for having done it. That is worth more than a punishment, in the long view." He looked at her steadily. "You are a remarkable person," he said. She held his gaze. She had become more comfortable with his directness over the weeks. "You say that as if it surprises you," she said. "It does not surprise me," he said. "I knew it early. What surprises me is that you remain remarkable after everything that has been done to try to reduce you." She was quiet for a moment. The working room was warm, and the winter light was flat and clear, through the small window above her table, and the ledgers were open in front of her, and everything around her was real and solid and present. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I know I am here as a member of your household staff," she said. "I want to continue to be here in that capacity, and I am grateful for it. But I want to tell you honestly that what you have done in these months, the questions you asked, the letters you wrote, the process you set in motion, it has given me something I did not have before. Not just the position, something else." She thought about how to say it precisely, which was always how she approached things that mattered. You saw what was done to me, and you treated it as a thing that required a response. You did not tell me it was unfortunate. You did not express sympathy and move on. You did something, and the doing of it has told me something important. What has it told you? He said. His voice was quiet. That what happened to me mattered, she said. Not just to me, to someone outside of me. That is not a small thing when you have spent a long time being treated as though you do not matter. He was very still. The morning light lay across the space between them, and neither of them moved. You matter, he said, not as a comfort, as a statement of fact, delivered with the same weight he gave to other facts. She looked at him. She did not deflect it, or minimize it, or redirect it. She received it. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Then he looked down at the letter in his hand, at Arthur Penfield's precise writing. I will have this filed, he said. He stepped back from the doorway. She turned back to the accounts. The numbers were steady in front of her, the familiar pattern of the ledger columns, the work she understood and trusted. But underneath the work, something was settling, something that had been in motion for months and was arriving now at a place of rest. The Alderton household was facing its consequence. The debt Charles had incurred had been formally separated from any claim on Mei Lin's labor, and Charles would need to find another way to address it, which was an inconvenience she felt no sympathy about. The mark on her forehead was fading, not gone but lighter, and would fade further with time. She could not unhappen the 8 years. She could not undo the words her aunt had never said, or the care she had never received, or the mornings she had worked through illness, because there was no one in that house who would have told her to rest. She could not change the fact of what Louise had done, or the fact that she had arrived at this estate wearing it. But she was here now. She was known here. She was working at something that used the full range of what she was capable of, not a fraction of it. Not the carrying and scrubbing and service of the Alderton years, but the accounts and the records, and the quarterly reports, and the year-end analysis that required her actual mind. She picked up her pen and returned to the investment section of the year-end accounts, and she worked through it with the same steady, careful attention she gave everything, her pen moving down the column of figures, her mind clear and focused and present. Outside the window, the December afternoon was going quiet and cold. The grounds were still and bare. Inside the working room, it was warm, and the lamp on the table was lit against the fading light, and the year-end accounts were coming together correctly, number by number, the estate's financial life becoming clear on the page. She worked until the evening light was gone. Then she closed the ledger and laid her pen down and stretched her fingers and sat for a moment in the lamplight. Then she went to the kitchen, where Clara was keeping her plate warm, and she sat at the table among the people who had come, in their different ways, to constitute something like her world, and she ate her dinner and was warm. The letter from Louise Alderton arrived in early January. Mei Lin was at her table when Mrs. Dunn brought it to her. Mrs. Dunn said nothing, only set it on the edge of the table and left. The envelope had the magistrate's court seal on it, alongside the Alderton return address, which meant it had been reviewed before being forwarded. She looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then she set her pen down and picked it up. It was 4 pages, written in Louise's handwriting, which was large and slightly irregular, the handwriting of someone who had been educated properly, but did not write frequently enough for it to settle into consistency. The pages were not crumpled or blotted, which meant she had written them carefully, possibly written them more than once. Mei Lin read the letter slowly. It began with Louise saying that she understood she was required to write this letter, and that she was writing it because she had been required to, but also because she needed to, and that the needing to was not something she had expected to feel, but had been feeling for some time. It was a careful beginning, and it was honest about its own conditions, which was a better start than false simplicity would have been. The letter described what Louise had done in plain terms, without the mitigation of context or the softening of euphemism. She had taken a hat pin and heated it over a candle until the tip was very hot, and she had pressed the tip to Mei Lin's skin deliberately and held it there long enough to leave a permanent mark. She had chosen the word deliberately. She had done it in the half-dark of the early morning, when Mei Lin would not be able to see her clearly or call for help that would be heeded. She described this in 4 sentences that were among the most honest sentences Mei Lin had read in a long time, because they did not flinch, and they did not soften, and they accepted the full weight of what they were describing. Then Louise wrote about why. This section was longer and less certain, the handwriting slightly less controlled, as if the writing was going ahead of the certainty of the thought. She wrote about the years of watching Mei Lin in the house, and the particular feeling of discomfort that Mei Lin's presence had produced in her. She did not dress this up. She said that she had disliked Mei Lin for the worst possible reason, because Mei Lin was better at things that mattered, and because her dignity in difficult circumstances made Louise feel ashamed of her own behavior, without ever intending to. She said she had tried to make Mei Lin afraid because she could not make her feel lesser by other means, and she had needed, for a reason she was still not fully proud to examine, to feel above her. She said the mark was the end of that need becoming something she could not take back. She wrote that she did not expect Mei Lin to forgive her. She wrote that she was not certain she deserved forgiveness, but she wanted Mei Lin to know that she had thought about it every day since it happened, and that the thinking had changed her in a way she could not fully describe, but that she recognized as significant, and that she was trying to understand the person she had been, and to become a different one. At the end, she wrote something that Mei Lin read twice. She wrote, "I think I was afraid of you because you were free, in a way I was not, even though you had nothing. You knew who you were. I did not know who I was. I still do not know entirely, but I am beginning to think the not knowing is where I should be starting from. I am sorry for what I did. I am sorry for the 8 years before it. I am sorry that I saw you clearly enough to envy you, and not clearly enough to see what I was doing to a person who had already had too much taken from her." Mei Lin set the letter down. She sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the winter light coming through the small window and thought about Louise at 17, writing those words, finding that truth in herself and writing it down, submitting it to strangers to read before it could reach the person it was meant for. She thought about what it cost to write honestly about the worst thing you have done when you are 17 and still in the process of finding out who you are. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she took out her own paper and began to write. She wrote for an hour. She wrote a reply that was as honest as the letter had been. She told Louise that she had read the letter with genuine attention, and that the honesty in it was real, and she could feel the difference between that and performed honesty. She told her that the years in the Alderton house had been difficult in ways she had long since categorized and put away, not because they had not mattered, but because continuing to suffer from them served no purpose, and she had other things to do with her energy. She said that the mark on her forehead was fading, as the physician at the estate had expected it to do, and that while it would not disappear entirely, she had decided some time ago that she was not going to let it define what she was. She told Louise that she did not offer forgiveness as something Louise had earned, or as something designed to make Louise feel better, because forgiveness of that kind was transactional and not the real thing. But she said that she did not hold what Louise had done in active anger, that she had chosen not to, because anger of that kind would cost her more than it would cost Louise, and she was too careful with her own resources to spend them that way. She said that she thought Louise was beginning something by writing as she had written, beginning to know herself, and that the not knowing was the right place to start because at least it was true. She said she hoped Louise would keep at it. She sealed the letter and addressed it to the Alderton house and left it for posting. She sat for a moment after, very still. There was a feeling she was trying to identify. Not relief exactly, something more complete than relief. The feeling of a long loop closing, not perfectly, not with everything tied off neatly, but with the ragged ends acknowledged and the shape of the thing visible at last. She picked up her pen and went back to work. January and February moved through the estate in the particular way of deep winter, slow and gray, and punctuated by bursts of harsh cold, but also with a quality of waiting, a sense of the world gathering itself for what came next. Mei Lin moved through those months steadily, the accounts, the walks, the evenings in the kitchen with Clara and sometimes Oliver, and the conversations with the Duke that had become, without being formally declared anything, a regular part of the rhythm of the house. They talked most often in the evenings, after supper, when the working day was finished and the house was quiet. Sometimes it was in the library, where she had begun borrowing books with his permission, and had discovered a reading practice she had lost during the years in the Alderton house, where there was never time or peace for sustained reading. Sometimes it was in the working room, where he would come after his own work was done and sit in the chair by the wall, not with anything specific to discuss, but simply there. They talked about what they were reading. They talked about the estate, about decisions he was weighing, and she had opinions about these and offered them carefully, not overstepping, but also not withholding when she had something worth saying. He received what she said, the way he received everything, with genuine attention, and without the reflexive dismissal that she had come to recognize in people who listened only for the confirmation of what they already thought. They talked sometimes about their own lives, not in great emotional detail, but in the way that two people who trust each other begin to share the shape of things. He told her about his father, who had been demanding in specific ways and generous in others, and about learning to separate the useful things he had inherited from his father from the unhelpful ones. She told him about her father reading to her in the evenings in the small house, and about what she had found in those books that had kept her company through the long years that followed. He told her about his wife, once, briefly and carefully, the way he spoke about things that were real to him. He said her name was Catherine. He said she had been very kind and also very funny, which was a combination he had found rare. He said he had loved her, and that her death 3 years ago had left a silence in the house that he had gotten used to, but had not fully resolved. He said this looking at his hands, not at Mei Lin, and she sat with it, without rushing into the space it left. She said, after a moment, "The silence in a house after a person leaves is its own presence." He looked up at her. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." They looked at each other for a moment, and between them was the particular understanding that comes from two people who have both lived with loss and who have found, each in their own way, how to carry it without being brought down by it. In March, the first indications of spring began to appear at the edges of the estate. The bare hedges put out pale green tips, the ground softened, the light began to last longer in the afternoons, and the walks Mei Lin took along the stone wall path became lighter and less cold, and sometimes the sun was actually present when she went, which was different from the gray certainty of winter. She noticed things on those walks that she wrote in her notebook, the way the returning light changed the color of the stone wall from dark gray to a kind of silver, the first bird she heard after the winter silence, the smell of the ground as it warmed. She was also, though she was careful with the thought, noticing something about herself, something that was different from the careful, defended person she had been a year ago, a kind of opening, not naivety. She was not becoming naive. She had been formed by too much reality for that. But something that was less armored, something that was allowing things in, that she had kept at a distance for a very long time. She was aware that part of this was specific to Edward Harlow. She had known her own feelings with her usual precision, the particular ease she felt in his presence, the specific quality of his attention that she had not experienced before from anyone except her father, and which was different from her father's attention in all the ways it would have to be, being the attention of a man she was coming to regard as, among other things, someone she might love. She held this knowledge the way she held most important things, carefully, and without rushing it into something it was not yet ready to be. She did not know what he felt or what he intended. She was not the kind of person who made assumptions about things like that. She was also, she admitted to herself on a cold March afternoon, walking beside the stone wall, not quite the same person she had been when she arrived, the person who had kept everything outside at a careful distance, because letting anything inside had cost too much in a place where safety was not guaranteed. This place was different. She was allowed to be different here. She thought about this, and looked at the silver stone, and the pale green tips of the hedges, and the wide winter-clearing sky, and she breathed, in and out, steadily, the way her father had taught her, and she felt, beneath all of it, and running through all of it, the quiet, solid, remarkable feeling of being alive in a place where she was known. That was not nothing. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the thing she had been working toward for 8 years, without being able to see it clearly. She walked back toward the house in the long afternoon light, and through the kitchen window she could see the warmth of the lamp inside, and Clara moving between the stove and the counter, and the shape of Oliver at the table with his tea. She pushed the door open and went inside. On the first Sunday of April, Edward Harlow asked Mei Lin if she would walk with him after the midday meal. This was not unusual. They had walked together on several occasions now, along the stone wall path, or through the home wood, where the trees were beginning to fill out their new leaves. But there was something in the way he asked this time that she noticed, a precision in his manner, the kind that appeared when he had thought something through completely and had arrived at a point of commitment. She said yes and put on her coat. They went out through the kitchen garden, which was coming alive again after winter. The beds turned, and the first seedlings set in rows. The afternoon was mild and bright, and the sky was the particular blue of early spring, clear all the way up without the weight of winter in it. They walked past the kitchen garden and out through the gate into the wider grounds, toward the south meadow where the grass was coming in new and green, and the stone wall ran along the far edge. They walked in silence for a few minutes. She did not fill the silence. She had learned that his silences were working silences, that he used them to gather what he was going to say, and that speaking into them before he was ready would not help either of them. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. "I thought you might," she said. He glanced at her, and that particular expression appeared, the one she had come to recognize as amusement wearing composure, a slight shift around his eyes. "I have been thinking about this carefully," he said, "for some months." "I know," she said. He looked at her directly. "You know? You think carefully about everything for a long time before you say it," she said. "I have observed this about you." "What have you concluded from the observation?" he said. She considered this honestly. "That you are not impulsive, and that when you say something, you mean it," she said, "which is a quality I find very valuable in a person." "I am glad to hear that," he said. They walked a few more steps. Then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to make sure, before I ask it, that you understand the basis from which I am asking." She looked at him. "The basis is not obligation," he said. "It is not gratitude. It is not an extension of the arrangement that brought you here. Those are all things that would make this question wrong, and if any of them were the basis, I would not be asking." He paused. "The basis is that I have spent 6 months in the company of someone I consider remarkable and honest, and someone whose presence has made this house and my own life significantly more real, and I find that I do not want to imagine that changing." She kept her pace steady and her breathing even. "I am asking if you would consider becoming my wife," he said. The meadow was very quiet around them. The new grass moved slightly in a breeze that was still carrying a touch of winter in it, the last of it almost gone. Above the stone wall at the far edge of the meadow, a bird that she had heard several times this spring but had not yet identified was singing its 3-note song. She walked a few steps more before she answered. "I want to tell you something in return," she said, "before I answer." "Yes," he said. "When I arrived here," she said, "I had spent 8 years in a place that had ground me down, as far as I was capable of being ground down, without losing myself entirely. I had nothing. I had my work habits, and my notebook, and the memory of my father, and a stubbornness I am not certain I can fully explain, but that has refused to leave me. I arrived here with a mark on my forehead, and no money, and no standing, and no expectation that the place I was going would be better than the place I had come from." She paused. The 3-note bird sang again above the wall. "What I found here was not what I expected," she said. "You asked a question no one had ever thought to ask. You listened to the answer. You treated what had happened to me as something that required action, not just acknowledgement. You gave me work that used what I actually am, rather than a fraction of it, and you gave me, without labeling it or making it a ceremony, something I had not had since I was 14 years old, which was the experience of being in a place where I was genuinely known." She looked at him then, and her expression held everything she was, nothing kept back. "I am not answering you out of gratitude," she said. "I want to be clear about that, because you were clear about the basis of your asking, and I want the same honesty. I am answering from the same place you are asking from, which is from a genuine feeling that I could not have anticipated 6 months ago, and that I have examined carefully, because I examine everything carefully, and it is real." He had stopped walking. He was very still, looking at her, with everything that was usually composed and measured and deliberate in him held in suspension. "Yes," she said, "I would." The word was simple and small and true, and it landed between them, with the weight of everything they had both been through, to arrive at the point where it could be said. He did not speak immediately. He stood and looked at her, and what was in his face was something she had not seen on him before, or only in glimpses, a complete absence of the protective composure, something open and certain and full, Then he said, "Thank you." She thought about the things those two words had carried between them. The first time she said them to him in the study, when he asked about the mark. The times he had said them to her. "Thank you for telling me. Thank you for asking." Two people who had practiced gratitude, not as performance, but as a real exchange, acknowledging what the other had given. "Thank you," she said back, meaning it exactly. They stood in the April meadow for a long moment, and the bird above the wall sang its 3 notes, and the spring light lay across the grass, in a way that was impossible to hold, and impossible to forget. Then they turned and walked back toward the house together. Clara was in the kitchen when they came in. She looked at their faces, and she knew immediately, because Clara had the particular intelligence of the heart that sees what other kinds of intelligence sometimes miss. Her expression went into something luminous, and she pressed her lips together and said absolutely nothing, which was the most sophisticated response she could have given. Oliver came in at 4, as he always did. He stood at the counter and looked at Mei Lin, and then at the Duke's direction, and then back at Mei Lin. Then he picked up his mug and drank his tea and said, in his usual quiet voice, "About time." The Duke looked at him. "Sir," Oliver added. There was a short silence, and then a sound from the Duke that Mei Lin had never heard before, and that she would remember for the rest of her life. A genuine, unguarded laugh, low and warm and completely undefended. In the weeks that followed, the estate moved into the full business of spring, the farms active, the grounds being restored to their growing season order, the household accounts reflecting the increased activity. Mei Lin worked through it all with her usual steady efficiency, and now there was the additional complexity of the estate preparations for the change in the household, the paperwork and the formal notices, and the arrangements that Edward's solicitor needed to handle. She was involved in some of these discussions, and absent from others, by her own preference, because she understood that the practical arrangements of their future together were not the thing that mattered most to her about it. The thing that mattered was already settled and real, and did not need a document to make it so. She wrote in her notebook in those weeks, not about feelings, still not that. She was not a person who narrated her own emotions to herself, but about what she noticed. The way the library looked in spring light compared to winter, the sound of the estate in warm weather, the additional voices from the farm workers in the fields, the birds returned to the trees of the home wood, the particular morning energy of a place that is fully alive again after months of cold. She wrote about a conversation she and Edward had one evening in the library, about a book they were both reading, about a sentence in it that had stayed with them both for different reasons, and the way they had each explained their reasons, and how the different reasons made the sentence richer than either of them had found it alone. She wrote that down because it seemed important to keep. Two people reading the same thing, and each finding something different in it, and then giving that difference to each other, so that both of them ended with more than they started with. That was what this was. That was what a good life between two people could be. Each one giving the other more than they had alone, not completing them, because she did not believe in the idea that a person was incomplete on their own. She had spent too many years proving herself whole under difficult conditions to accept that, but adding to them, making the sum of the two of them more than either of them would have been alone. She thought about her father and the evenings of reading and how he had given her the beginning of the person she became, the love of books and the careful attention and the stubbornness that had refused to leave her. She thought about the years in the Alderton house and what she had built in that time, not despite the difficulty, but in some ways through it, the discipline of finding good things to attend to, the practice of not letting bitterness take what they had not already taken. She thought about the cart that had brought her through the rain to the iron gate of this estate, and the mark on her forehead, and the way she had walked up the gravel path in the cold, with her bundle in her arms, and her heart very quiet, and her intention simply to survive. She thought about what she had found instead. On the Sunday of the wedding, she dressed in a room at the estate that she had come to think of as hers. Clara helped her, because Clara had asked, and because saying no to Clara's asking would have been wrong when the offer came from such a genuine place. Clara did not talk too much. She was good at silence when silence was what was needed. When Mei Lin looked in the mirror, she looked at her whole face with the clear attention she gave everything. The mark above her right brow had faded to a pale line, thin enough now that a person who did not know to look would not necessarily see it. She looked at it and she looked at herself, this woman in the mirror who had been 14, and had nothing, and had come through a long dark passage, and had arrived here, at this particular morning, in this particular room, with the window open to the April air, and the smell of the grounds coming in, and the sound of the house preparing for something good. She did not cover the mark. She had not covered it in months. She did not think about covering it now. It was part of her face, and her face was the honest account of her life, and she was not interested in presenting a version of herself that omitted the things that had happened to her. The things that had happened to her were not shameful. The shame, where any existed, belonged somewhere else entirely. She was ready. The ceremony itself was small. It was the size it was, because they both preferred it that way, not because of any limitation. Edward did not need to perform his life, and Mei Lin had never needed anyone to witness her life, in order to feel it was real. The witnesses were Penfield and his wife, Mrs. Dunn, Clara, Oliver, and Sam, who had shot up several inches since Mei Lin's arrival, and who stood very straight throughout the ceremony, with the serious dignity of a young person being entrusted with an important occasion. Afterward, there was food in the dining room, a proper meal, and someone had found spring flowers for the table, white and pale yellow, and the windows were open to the afternoon light. At some point during the meal, Mei Lin looked across the table at Edward, who was in conversation with Penfield about something practical and good-humored, and he caught her eye across the conversation, and the table, and the flowers, and there was a moment between them that needed no words, and contained, in a look that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, the whole of what this was. She looked away, and someone beside her said something, and she responded, and the meal continued. Later in the afternoon, when most people had gone, and the house was settling into its evening quiet, she went to her working room. Old habit. She sat at her table with the lamp on, and opened her notebook to the next clean page. She sat for a while without writing, looking at the empty page. Then she wrote the date. Then she wrote 3 sentences. The light today was the specific gold of April afternoons, the kind that makes everything it touches look exactly like itself. The homewood is fully in leaf. I am here. She closed the notebook and held it for a moment in both hands, this small, worn book that had been the truest record of who she was, through all the years when no one else was keeping that record. Then she put it away, and went to find her husband. The house was warm, and the evening was beginning, and outside the windows, the April light was doing what April light does at the end of good days, going slowly and beautifully gold, stretching the shadows long across the grounds, making the new leaves glow at their edges. She walked through the house she knew well now, every floorboard and door and window and corner of it, and she was at home in it, in the way that you can only be at home, somewhere you have come to through your own will and your own work, and not simply found yourself in. She had been sent here as something to be used, and she had become, through the specific quality of her own character, and the specific decency of one man who had thought to ask a question no one else had thought to ask, herself, in the fullest possible way. The word they had cut into her skin had never described her. She had always known that. But now the world around her knew it too. And the world that mattered, the world of this house, and this life, and the man at the center of it, had known it from the beginning, from the moment he looked at her in the hallway, and said welcome to the house, with the simplicity of someone who meant it. She had been welcomed. She was welcome. She was home. She pushed open the door to the library, and went inside.